Chapter 2748 Pursuit. The electric eel didn't give Han Sen a moment to gather his thoughts. It continued to spew lightning, and whenever Han Sen saw its mouth gape open, a new burst of lightning soon surged over him. The creature attacked with the literal speed of lightning. Pang! Gritting his teeth, Han Sen raised the shield of the Medusa's gaze right in front of himself. It deflected the lightning that was about to touch down on him. But Han Sen had underestimated how scary that lightning truly was. The lightning couldn't harm the shield, but when the lightning exploded, it cast a net of electricity that reached behind and ensnared Han Sen, who was hiding behind the shield. If Han Sen was able to activate the power within the shield, he could enable its true protection, which would provide 360 degrees of cover. But right now, Han Sen could only use the shield like an ordinary piece of metal. He couldn't activate its power. He could only shield himself from the power that was coming for him from the front. The lightning again racked Han Sen's body. He shook more violently than a lady twerking as hard as she could. This is 8 lifetimes of bad luck. Han Sen moaned a lot as he continued to spasm. The electric eel was a powerful foe. There was no doubt about that. And Han Sen could barely scratch the creature, despite using everything he could against it. The numbing power of that lightning simply ignored his attacks and defense. While it didn't seem capable of killing him, it hurt like hell. It also severely decreased his performance in battle. The electric eel seemed to know that its lightning attacks were working against Han Senator. It wasn't stingy with its attacks, as it kept launching salvos of electric bolts. Han Sen couldn't block the lightning, and he couldn't dodge it either. He simply didn't have the time to teleport away, and so he couldn't dodge a single lightning bolt. He could only use the shield to block the lightning now and again. Every time he got electrified, he would twitch and convulse violently. It was like his body had installed an electric motor that made him shake super fast. Just because I've been keeping my temper in check, you think you can treat me like a Hello Kitty when I'm actually a tiger? Han Sen thought in rage. His jaw tightened, and the story of Jean's armor appeared around him. It activated a solidifying power that let Han Sen run crazily fast. Pang! Another bolt of lightning struck the Medusa's shield. The bolt exploded with a crackle of electricity, but Han Sen's body was shielded. This time, the lightning was unable to reach Han Sen's vulnerable flesh. Han Sen's forever solid power made the spell armor, and his body invulnerable to change. Electricity couldn't spread through his armor and flesh, so no paralytic effect would linger on him. Now it's my turn to show off. Han Sen lifted his shield and ghost teeth knife. He pushed back the electric eel's lightning and moved forward, looking for a chance to slash the electric eel. The electric eel's power was stronger than Han Sen's demonic strength. But luckily, Han Sen's shield took most of the attack. The lightning that exploded couldn't harm Han Sen, who was still under the influence of Forever Solid. Han Sen's knife airs couldn't do anything to the electric eel. The electric eel broke each one of his strikes with ease. The man and the eel seemed to have reached a stalemate. One of them was looking for a chance to use his knife light, while another spewed countless bolts of lightning. They made the sea around them churn and slosh, the water forming whirlpools and powerful eddies as they fought. Much of the water was vaporized even. Pang! Han Sen caught yet another barrage of lightning on his shield, and the impact pushed his body back 10 meters. This was the 100th time Han Sen had been pushed back thus far. It looks like I have to get a deified knife. Ghost teeth knife is just king class. Using it to fight a deified is demonstrating that it clearly no longer has the strength to compete at my level. Han Sen thought sadly when he saw the cracks that were slowly spreading along Ghost teeth knife's blade. Han Sen had been using that knife for a long time, so it was sad to see it get broken like this. Arg! Han Sen shouted. He thrust forward with Ghost teeth knife, unleashing a knife light that seemed to encompass all of space. The raging knife lights converged into a scary knife stream that was headed for the electric eel. The electric eel's electric substance chains exploded out from its body in a writhing cloud. The endless stream of knife lights was like a flood. After fighting for a while, the knife lights finally broke through the electric net. Han Sen's attack went forward to strike the scales of the villain. Han Sen's hailstorm of attacks slammed into the eel, each impact giving off a metallic shriek. A few thousand knife lights tested their might against the hard scales of the electric eel. They finally drew blood, which seeped out from the wound in a steady stream. The electric eel squealed in pain, and it swung its tail. It became a flash of lightning as it escaped. Han Sen didn't even move for a split second. He was too stunned by the creature's speed. Not even his Apollo wings would be enough to catch up with the eel. You want to run? Escaping me won't be so easy. You ate my prey, and you're going to have to cough up a lot of interest when you pay that debt. Han Sen cast teleport and quickly followed it. The electric eel's lightning was so powerful that Han Sen's teleportation abilities almost weren't enough to follow it. He wasn't going to be able to close the gap between them. Let us see how long you can keep this up for, Han Sen angrily muttered. He summoned his Dongxian armor to replace the spell armor he had been wearing. The Dongxian armor connected with the entire universe, allowing him to continually pull power from the universe itself. That meant that Han Sen's energy reserves were essentially infinite. He never had to worry about how much energy things and activity of technique would cost. He could keep using teleportation techniques without the fear of exhaustion. Teleporting generally a lot of energy, but it wouldn't tire him out now. After the Dongxian Sutra became deified, it heightened his connection with the universe and provided him with even more power. As long as he wore the Dongxian armor, his body was practically a generator with an infinite amount of gas. He didn't have to worry about how much power he used. Even high-level deified elites that were deadlier than Han Sen would lose if things boiled down to a comparison of energy reserves. The electric eel didn't know how strong Han Sen was, so it kept trying to use its electricity to swim away as fast as possible. Its electric skills were Geno arts that cost a lot of energy, and after Han Sen chased the beast for half the day, he could sense that it was starting to slow. Run! You keep on running. If you compare your endurance with mine, you are sure to lose. Even if I let you run for 3 days, I can still keep up. This isn't the first time that I've chased the blood trail of weakening prey, Han Sen said, feeling rather cocky. While he was thinking, he saw a bolt of lightning in front of him. The electric eel headed into an underwater coral forest and disappeared. The coral forest was stately and beautiful. All of the coral was 10 meters high, and it glowed softly, like some ancient mystic shrine. You think I will be unable to find you if you're hiding? Han Sen curled his lips in a disdainful sneer. He used his Dongxian area to search the entirety of the coral forest. After his Dongxian area became deified, the radius had expanded. He could now spread his senses over tens of thousands of miles of the blood coral forest. With such a wide search range, Han Sen was confident he could discover even tiny minnows, let alone a giant electric eel. When Han Sen's Dongxian area covered the whole blood coral forest, he was given a shock. His senses didn't seem capable of penetrating the blood coral forest. Weird. What is so special about all of this blood coral? It is stopping me from using the Dongxian area to search for the eel. The coral itself cannot be special, surely. The forest is so large that each piece of coral must be worth less than a head of Chinese cabbage. Han Sen looked at the blood coral forest with shock. Chapter 2749 Blood Coral. The Dongxian area couldn't reveal what lay inside the coral forest, and so Han Sen was a little hesitant about proceeding with the chase. But he didn't want to let the electric eel off the hook scot-free. So he made up his mind. He ventured down into the forest. If that electric eel can survive in there, can't I do the same? Han Sen made his mind up. He was going to kill that electric eel and dine on its xenogenic gene, no matter what it took. Steeling himself, Han Sen began to move through the coral forest. After he entered it, the effectiveness of his Dongxian area fell dramatically. He couldn't see beyond the blood coral all around him. The blood coral was like a signal disruptor. It prohibited Han Sen's power from penetrating the red pillars that surrounded him. Han Sen kept traveling through the sea, and he observed the blood coral carefully as he went by. The blood coral looked like ordinary coral, but for some reason, the power of Han Sen's Dongxian area couldn't get close to it. That being said, it didn't seem as if the blood coral was a living creature. If it was like normal coral, then swarms of small sea creatures should have been making their homes among it. But strangely, Han Sen had been inside the blood coral forest for a while now, and he hadn't seen another living creature. Not a single fish swam through the red trunks, and not even one crab scurried around the sandy floor of the coral forest. This place is really weird. I can't find a single xenogeniac. Is this the electric eel's nest? Is it designed like this to prohibit any other creatures from daring to get close? Hansen wondered to himself. The blood coral forest was around 10,000 miles wide, so it wasn't that big. Hansen traveled steadily, and he had ventured through half of it before long. He had yet to find the body of the electric eel, but he also hadn't encountered any danger. It was like a dead zone that remained perfectly quiet and still. While Hansen was pondering this mystery, he suddenly saw a light coming from inside the blood coral forest. When viewed from a distance, it was like a sun that had risen just over the horizon in the morning. It was red, but it didn't really shine all that brightly. It simply glowed like heated steel. What is that? Hansen could see the light, but because of the blood coral, he couldn't see what was causing it. Since Hansen had only just arrived in the coral forest, he couldn't leave just yet. He had to keep going forward and exploring. As Hansen slowly drew nearer to the light started to look brighter. After many more coral stacks, Hansen discovered the source of that illumination. It was a piece of blood coral that was releasing the red light. This particular coral tower looked different from all the other blood coral. It was much shorter than the rest of the coral, only standing 3 or 4 meters high. Compared to the other blood coral, that could be 10 meters high, this one was quite diminutive. It was a darker color than the rest of the blood coral too. The color was mysterious, and it was releasing a red light. The entire piece of coral seemed to glow. The blood coral was oddly shaped too. Instead of having many branches like ordinary coral, this one had only a few small twigs. In addition, the main stalk was all twisted up. This blood coral, why does it look like a dragon? Hansen looked at the blood coral as these thoughts flashed through his mind. The coral's shape was distinctly serpentine. It looked like a dragon that was circling among the clouds. Its shape suggested that it wanted to soar ever higher. But it was just a piece of coral. Still, it gave people a weird feeling that it was about to break free of the soil and fly to Cloud 9. Weird. What is this strange red coral thing? It looks very amazing, but it doesn't look like it is alive, Hansen thought to himself. Hansen was standing some distance from the strange coral, trying to decide whether he should approach, when he heard the water stir. A weird rubbing noise broke the silence. La! La! He turned to where the noise was coming from, and he saw that the blood coral forest was shaking like mad. Not long after, he saw the electric eel emerge from among the coral. Because its body was too big, when it traveled between the trunks of the blood coral, its body would brush against the coral. But the blood coral didn't fall, or break, due to the electric eel's crude movements. In fact, some of the coral had sharp edges that actually cut through the electric eel's skin. The edges sliced effortlessly through the scales that looked like diamonds, covering the electric eel with many small wounds. The electric eel didn't seem very concerned about the injuries though. It was still forcing its way quickly through the coral bushes. In seconds, it reached the twisted coral tree that looked like a blood dragon. When it was 10 meters away from that weird coral, the electric eel finally stopped. Its eyes were intense as it scanned the blood coral. It didn't move for some time. It looks like the electric eel's sensing powers have also been dampened by the coral forest. Otherwise, it would definitely have realized that I am so close to it. Hansen had hidden behind a large stack of coral. He had leaned around the coral to get a better look at what the electric eel was doing. The electric eel looked at the blood coral for a while. Eventually, it seemed to come to a decision. It drew closer to the blood coral, then opened its mouth wide and swallowed the weird blood coral and the sand around it. The enormous maw of the eel left a 10-meter-wide hole in the sea floor. Things happened too quickly, though, and Hansen didn't have time to react. When he saw the electric eel gulp down the weird blood coral, he instantly regretted his own inaction. It looks like that piece of blood coral was good stuff. If I had known that, I would have taken it first. Hansen's heart suddenly jumped as another thought crossed his mind. This is the buried dragon sea. The legends say a true god-class evil dragon died here. That blood coral couldn't be related to the true god dragon, could it? If that is true, then I've missed out on something incredibly potent. I should have picked it up first. While Han Sun was regretting his life choices, he saw the electric eel that had eaten the blood coral start to thrash. It began convulsing and twisting its body, churning up the water around it. Its body erupted with wild lightning, but when the lightning touched the nearby blood coral, it was extinguished. It didn't leave so much as a scorch mark on the coral forest. This coral is so powerful. The electric eel has such a scary lightning power, yet the coral wasn't damaged by a full power attack. This blood coral seems to be made of harder materials than a primitive treasure, and this is a large coral forest. If I could take it all with me and use it to build a castle, then the castle would even bar the entrance of deified elites. Han Sun started to drool as he thought of this. He eyed the blood coral most lecherously. His mind began planning how to take thousands of miles of blood coral home with him. Once he had his own xenogenic space, he could use that blood coral to build a fortress. And then, he could have 3 palaces, 6 rooms in each, occupied by 72 wives. That would be delicious. Meanwhile, the electric eel seemed to be in agony. Its body repeatedly twitched, while its tail kept slapping the sand, forming a big hole in the bottom of the seabed. Its diamond-like scales suddenly became red. It looked like all of the creature's blood vessels had burst, and the blood was dyeing the creature's skin. Ah, what is this? Han Sun didn't bother watching the suffering of the electric eel as it struggled and writhed. Its thrashing had opened a hole where the weird blood coral had once been, and the hole seemed to be utterly devoid of sand. There was, however, something red glowing in the depths of the depression. Chapter 2750 Powerful slashing and killing the glowing object in the hole looked kind of like the weird blood coral that the eel had just eaten. It looked red, and it gave off a faint bloody light. Han Sun could tell that it had nothing to do with the coral though. Its surface was as smooth and polished as a mirror, and there were curves to its shape. The part of it that Han Sun could see was only about the size of a kitchen table. Han Sun couldn't tell what it was, but the creativity of humans could be rather amazing. Han Sun had already been thinking about the true god dragon, so when he saw the glowing object, his heart leaped. His brain flashed with an idea. No matter which way you look at it, this thing looks like a giant dragon scale. This cannot be the body of the legendary true god-class evil dragon, can it? After the electric eel ate the blood coral, it continued to twist and convulse. Its body was growing redder and redder. I'll kill you while you are sick. This is a nifty opportunity. Han Sun stopped hesitating. While the electric eel was still writhing in pain, Han Sun began to generate power using Ghost Teeth Knife. He teleported next to the electric eel, aimed at the beast's belly, and unleashed his swing. The electric eel was in too much pain, and it had no chance of protecting itself. Han Sun's knife stabbed toward the creature's belly, but the blade only left a small mark across the red scales. It didn't harm the electric eel too much, but the eel was already thrashing so badly that it almost whacked Han Sun with its tail. Holding his shield up to protect himself, Han Sun stabbed the creature a few more times. He cut a small wound into its stomach. In response, the electric eel's tail slapped Han Sun's shield, sending him flying a few hundred meters. When Han Sun teleported back, the wounds he had inflicted were being healed. They were healing so fast that he watched them seal back up. Ghost Teeth Knife really is useless now. I really have to find myself a deified knife at some point. The Buddha stole my knife blank, and I heard a while back that it got refined into a deified treasure. If I have the chance, I'm going to get my knife blank back, Han Sun thought to himself. Now that Ghost Teeth Knife was no longer useful for combat, he would have to rectify this situation sooner or later. Now that the electric eel had consumed the blood coral, its body had grown stronger. Its healing power had also intensified. Even Ghost Teeth Knife's ripping power couldn't stop the wounds from healing. It was a very strong foe to contend with. But at this time, the electric eel was also in incredible duress. It continued to writhe around on the seabed, and it didn't have time to deal with Han Sr. If I let it continue to change without killing it, I won't stand a chance later, Han Sun thought to himself. He made up his mind, and a weird shockwave of power emerged from his body. Han Sun's body changed fast. Ordinarily, the Dongxian armor and his spell armor couldn't be used at the same time. However, when Han Sun and spell combined to become a xenogeniac together, their powers were fused into one. Not just those two powers either. The Blood Pulse Sutra and Jade Skin were also a part of the furious mix. The four powers combined in a special way, making fundamental changes throughout Han Sen's body. He was now releasing a presence like a xenogeniac. His body looked like the dark form of some ruthless demon. It combined coldness and passion, holiness and evil, weirdness and beauty. It was a disturbing, chaotic scene. It was completely different from how Han Sun usually operated. At that moment, Han Sun no longer looked like a human. He looked like a cold and heartless xenogeniac demon king. Han Sun looked impassively at the electric eel that was twitching with pain. In his hand he clutched Ghost Teeth knife. It seemed to have been infected by his weird power. The purple and black colors of the knife became a pitch-black flame. Even the knife air darkened to black. Han Sun lifted his Ghost Teeth knife, and he could feel that the energy within him was now incredibly strong. Four types of battle bodies had merged into one, forming a xenogeniac battle body. Han Sen's battle power had become an inferno. I wonder if this xenogeniac battle body's power is enough to kill the electric eel now. If it can't, that would be rather annoying, Han Sen thought idly. He slashed toward the electric eel that was writhing around in pain. With that xenogeniac battle body's boon of power, Ghost Teeth knife's black flame roared to insane heights. It carried a scary knife air to slash across the electric eel's belly. Catcha! The diamond-like scales and hardened flesh of the electric eel were ripped open by Ghost Teeth knife. Han Sen's knife sank inside the beast, all the way to the hilt. Han Sun was delighted by this result. He lifted his knife and slashed the foe again. He cut the creature's belly open from one end to the other. The blood and internal organs spilled out all over the sea floor. Xenogeniac transmutation deified killed. Space electric eel. Deified xenogeniac gene found. Obtained space electric eel beast soul. Han Sun had never expected to kill the electric eel with such ease. He looked at the Ghost Teeth knife in his hand in shock. When he shook off his shock, Han Sun was crazily happy. His xenogeniac battle body was far more powerful than he thought it could be. He had killed a transmutation deified xenogeniac with ease. I didn't expect my xenogeniac battle body to be so strong. Such a scary power. I'm afraid it might be as strong as when I used Super God Spirit Body. Han Sun was filled with unfiltered joy at the thought. Han Sun retreated a little, allowing the blood to drain out of the electric eel's carcass for a while. Once the blood had drained, he could get a better look inside the electric eel's belly. In addition to the creature's organs, the weird blood coral was still inside the eel. Han Sen's mind might have been playing tricks on him, but the weird blood coral now looked even more like a dragon. The details were more defined than they had been. As he examined, Han Sun halfway expected the thing to open its eyes and fly away. Patterns were etched across the coral now, although Han Sun had no idea how they had gotten there. Perhaps the stomach acid of the electric eel had made them. Regardless, the patterns made the coral look even more like a dragon scale. This thing looks a bit evil. If the electric eel hadn't eaten this thing, I would have killed it so easily. As Han Sun examined the blood coral, he started to feel that something was wrong. The blood of a deified creature wouldn't blend into the sea water. It should sink to the bottom and pool there. However, Han Sun saw no blood pooling on the seafloor around him. Even the organs that fell out of the carcass were now clean, devoid of even a speck of blood. Where did all the god blood go? Han Sun stared at the blood coral that looked like a real dragon. The red light was growing brighter and brighter. This thing can't be alive, can it? Han Sun watched the blood coral warily, but it sank to the bottom without showing much of a reaction. He watched it for a while, but the chunk of blood coral didn't move. Then, Han Sun gathered up his power and grabbed the blood coral. He thought it would react when he touched it, but he picked the item up with ease. It was like an ordinary living chunk of coral. He examined it thoroughly, but it continued to sit silently in his palms, just as he would expect from an ordinary chunk of coral. He put it aside and swam into the hole it had made in the sea floor. If the evil dragon's body is really down here, I'm going to be meg rich, Han Sun thought to himself as he descended into the hole. Chapter 2751 Dead Dragon Body. When he arrived beside the black object at the bottom of the hole, Han Sun got a better look at the bloodlight that surrounded it. It was just like the blood coral. After confirming that there wasn't any danger, Han Sun reached his hand out to touch it. The object was hot to the touch, and the texture of the surface felt kind of like snakeskin, or the scales of some other sort of creature. But snakes were cold-blooded animals. Their scales were supposed to feel cool, but this black thing was burning hot. It glowed like heated steel. This thing can't be alive, can it? Han Sun knew that was impossible. The thing wasn't giving off any life force. He dug into the sand around the black object, and it was revealed to be the size of a house when he was all done. When he saw it in all its splendor, it was absolutely massive, just as he had expected. And beside the glowing scale was another scale. I'm rich. This could really be the carcass of the true god evil dragon. Maybe the blood coral has grown here, because of the nutrients it can absorb from the evil dragon's dead body. Han Sun's heart was frantic with excitement. He wanted to haul the body out of the lake as soon as possible, but he soon realized that he faced a serious problem. If a single scale was as big as a room, he couldn't imagine how big the entire dragon's body might be. Han Sun dug for a while, and he eventually dug under other parts of the blood coral forest. The dragon's scale seemed to extend even further under the ground. He couldn't accurately gauge how large the creature was. This dragon's body cannot extend the entire length of the 10,000-mile-wide blood coral forest, can it? Han Sun thought that must be possible. Otherwise, why would the blood coral only grow in this area and nowhere else? With Han Sun's power, he could easily dig beneath the blood coral. A large amount of sand could be thrown away with a simple wave, but displacing the blood coral itself was too much for him. Han Sun's power was insufficient, and all the strength he exhausted would be absorbed by the blood coral. He had to dig it out slowly, inch by inch. At that speed, and with Han Sun digging there alone, it would likely take him a year or two to excavate the dragon. Digging out the entire blood coral forest would be very difficult. No, I can't keep digging like this. Han Sun immediately realized that unearthing the dragon corpse by hand simply wasn't an option. Not to mention that if he continued, Li Qir and Exquisite were sure to find out what he was doing. The matter of the dragon body aside, even this blood coral, that can absorb elemental powers, is very rare and precious. The very high would desperately want something like that, even if there wasn't a true god corpse somewhere beneath it all. If the very high learned about this place and Han Sun's find, he wasn't sure if they would fight him for ownership. Although the very high allowed the silkworms to take the xenogeniacs they killed in outer sky, true god xenogeniac bodies were a bit more valuable than the average fare. It was too tempting, and Han Sun couldn't predict how things might play out if his discovery became known. I must find a way. How can I take the dragon body and blood coral without anyone noticing? Han Sun stopped digging. He replaced the sand he had disturbed with his digging, hiding all evidence that he had been there. After thinking over the matter for a while, Han Sun placed the strange blood coral into his destiny's tower. Then, he paused to examine the beast's soul he had received from the space electric eel. Deified xenogeniac beast soul, space electric eel. Gem beast soul, chance to evolve. Another gem beast soul? Han Sun was disappointed. Gem beast souls could raise the level of another beast soul and heighten its quality. But in order to use the beast soul, he would need another beast soul of the same type. Han Sun had received a gem beast soul from the Sun Raven, and he hadn't yet found another beast soul he could use that one on. In addition, he had no lightning element beast souls that he could combine with his most recent prize, the space electric eel's gem beast soul. What does the chance to evolve part mean? Han Sun was disappointed to receive another gem beast soul, but the words on the end of the description had managed to intrigue him somewhat. It was a shame the gem beast soul couldn't be used immediately. He also had no way of uncovering the secrets of the whole chance to evolve message just yet. He dragged the electric eel's body out of the buried dragon sea, and he found Bai Wei waiting for him on the shore. Han Sun went over to say hello. Bai Wei was surprised to see that Han Sun had actually defeated the electric eel. The conflicted emotions visible in her eyes deepened. After leaving the sea, Han Sun took the electric eel's corpse back to the star tree. Once he absorbed the electric eel's xenogenic gene, he noticed that eating the electric eel's flesh provided more deified genes than ordinary primitive deifieds did. He had only eaten 1 out of the 20 portions of the electric eel's flesh, and he had already received 2 deified gene points. It looks like higher-class deifieds provide more element genes. If that is the case, maxing out my deified points shouldn't be all that difficult. Leveling up will be far easier than I thought actually. Han-sun kept refining the xenogenic genes as fast as he could, all the while thinking about how he might dig up the blood coral and the dragon's body. The dragon's body seemed far too large to dig up on the sly, but I can surely collect some of the blood coral. I can store it in the sanctuary to keep anyone from discovering it. It might take a while, but I should be able to dig up all the blood coral by myself. Han-sun couldn't come up with a better idea than that. He needed to grab any benefit he could get while he was able to. He rested the night, and when he woke up the next day, he intended to go back to digging up the red coral. He needed that blood coral for the castle he was planning to build. But after yawning and stretching, he noticed that something in his body felt off. Han-sun couldn't really put his finger on the sensation, but when he looked at his hands, he noticed there was something there. What is going on? Han-sun got a better look at his hands, and what he saw frightened him. The back of each hand had a black dot that was around the size of a fingernail. It looked like a freckle at first glance, but when Han-sun looked closer, the freckle seemed more like a piece of red coral or a scale from the dragon's body. It was black, but it glowed with a faint red light. The freckle was still somewhat incorporeal though. He could still see his flesh through it. Han-sun swallowed nervously. He quickly checked over the rest of his body, and he found more freckles growing all over his body. What the fuck? Is this the sign of me growing dragon scales? Han-sun knew that something was severely wrong. Those freckles weren't painful or itchy, but they were spreading across his body. Han-sun used the Dongxian Sutra to examine the rest of his body, and he discovered that the freckles were now a part of him. They didn't seem to be damaging his body though. His body and the freckles were existing symbiotically. He steeled his resolve and peeled one of the freckles away, but when the flesh was healed, the black dot returned. More black dots showing up across his body with every minute that passed. He tried many ways to remove them, but none of them stuck. Han-sun tried activating his xenogenic genoarts, and he even tried using his super god spirit body. But no matter what he tried, no method worked to get rid of the black dots. That was especially surprising since the super god spirit body had worked on pretty much everything in the past. Now it couldn't do anything to remove the freckles. What the hell is this? Even my super god spirit body isn't working. Han-sun theorized that the freckles had something to do with the blood coral or the dragon body, but he couldn't accurately predict what effect the freckles might ultimately have. Chapter 2752 No Dragon. Han-sun thought about the matter for a while before he noticed that he had overlooked a very key concern. His super god spirit body made him invincible. That was its defining feature, and it could rid him of any negative energies that were impacting his body. But if he was being affected by energy that was coming from within him instead of invading from outside his body, then his super god spirit body wouldn't make any changes to it. Does this mean the freckles indicate that my body is changing on its own? Han-sun considered the possibility, but it didn't seem to hold water. Unless I was affected by an outside force, I shouldn't be growing freckles in the first place. Why will my super god spirit not purge the freckles like it does everything else? If growing freckles wasn't harmful to him, then his super god spirit body wasn't going to do anything. Even though Han-sun suspected the freckles might be the harbinger of something beneficial, he didn't fancy the prospect of turning into a freckle-covered monster. Han-sun thought of many ways to get rid of the freckles, but none of his attempts were successful, and the freckles were spreading more and more. Some of the freckles were already clumping together to take the shape of snake scales. Han-sun thought that the growing scales might be an effect of the blood coral, so he lobbed it back into the sea. But a short time later, Han-sun noticed that the blood coral had somehow returned to him. It was like a small, black dragon quietly waiting for him. This is terrible. Han Sun tried throwing the coral away a few more times, but nothing seemed to work. His scales continued to grow. It made him want to cry. For now, the scales weren't having any negative influence on him. They actually increased the defenses of his body. The scales also boosted his elemental resistances dramatically. When an attack landed on his scales, they would take away 80% of the damage incurred. If the scales expanded to cover his entire body, Han Sun's physical defense would be very scary. Even so, Han Sun didn't want to become some freak who was covered in scales. You couldn't hide a fire with paper. When Exquisite returned, she saw that Han Sun's body was covered in scales. It confused her quite a bit. Han Sun made no effort to hide anything from her. He told her everything, even the stuff concerning the blood coral and the dead dragon's body. He didn't want to turn into a monster, even if the process made him stronger. He couldn't get rid of the scales himself, so he had no choice but to ask for help. There were many elites among the very high, and they all had a lot of knowledge. They had studied geno arts from all across the universe. Perhaps one of them would know some technique that could get rid of the scales. Exquisite was more and more shocked as Han Sun told his story. Her eyes opened wide. She stared at the blood coral Han Sun was holding, the one that looked like a dragon. That true god-evil dragon. What sort of power did it have? Why would it make my body grow scales? Is there a way to remove them? Han Sun asked, his words almost tripping over each other in his haste. He really despised the freckle-like scales. He imagined that when he returned home, his daughter little Ling might not even recognize her father. Exquisite was frozen in place. She didn't immediately answer Han Sun's question, but her face was warped in thought. What is going on? Can you please say something? Han Sun begged, sensing that something very grave had happened. Exquisite moved her lips silently for a moment, and then she said the last thing that Han Sun had expected. The buried dragon sea doesn't contain a true god-evil dragon. That is just a legend. Exquisite looked at Han Sun weirdly. It doesn't? Han Sun asked, dumbfounded. Then he said, how can that be? What about the blood coral forest and the dragon corpse I found then? I don't know where the blood coral forest or the dragon carcass came from, but I can tell you for sure that the buried dragon sea doesn't contain an evil dragon. Or at least there isn't a true god-class xenogeneic. It is called the buried dragon sea, because a deified elite called Dragon died there. That is where it got its name. People started telling stories about the place, and eventually, the myth of an evil dragon dying there was created, Exquisite said. Even if the legend was fake, that doesn't mean that the buried dragon sea doesn't contain the body of a true god-evil dragon. Han Sun wasn't eager to give up on his find. It won't be what you think it is, Exquisite answered staunchly. She could feel Han Sun's questions, and she went on to say, a long time ago, the buried dragon sea didn't exist. There was an elite called Dragon that went there to fight. The battle devastated the landscape, creating the crater that you now know as the buried dragon sea. There were no high-class xenogeneics there, and because of the intense battle that happened there, even the resources of the local area were destroyed. No high-level xenogeneics go there of their own volition. The space electric eel you killed was something that one of our elders threw into the sea to grow. Most of the xenogeneics in the sea are brought there by similar methods. Our elders take xenogeneics there periodically, because they're trying to repopulate the buried dragon sea. If a true god being had once fallen in the buried dragon sea, the very high wouldn't have to go to such trouble. After Han Sun heard what she had to say, he conceded. She was probably right. If what she said was true, it was doubtful that the sea held a true god xenogeneic corpse. If it is impossible to find such a body there, then what kind of body did I stumble across? And what was that blood coral forest? Han Sun wondered in confusion. Exquisite could sense Han Sun's questions. I'm not sure. According to what I know of the buried dragon sea, there shouldn't be any such powerful creatures there. Han Sun thought for a minute, and then he asked, why did the elite called Dragon die in the buried dragon sea? Who was he? Are the blood coral forest and the corpse somehow related to him? Exquisite had a wry smile as she shook her head and answered, I don't know too much about the story. After all, it was a long time ago. All I know is that an elite named Dragon died there, and he hailed from sacred. The sacred of your? Han Sen was shocked, and he made sure to rein in his thoughts. Otherwise, Exquisite might pick up on the fact that he had something to do with sacred. How about this? I will take you to my ninth uncle. He was the person in charge of putting xenogeneics inside the buried dragon sea. Perhaps he will know a thing or two about this conundrum. He might not be able to answer your questions, but if there is anyone who can do something to fix your body, it will be Uncle Nine, Exquisite said after a moment of thought. Han Sen wasn't going to object to such a suggestion. He and Exquisite hurried out to visit the ninth uncle of the Very High. Although Han Sen really wanted to learn more about the person called Dragon, he didn't dare ask. He was afraid he might not be able to control his mind when it came to thinking about Sacred. If that happened, she might learn that his son was with Sacred right at that moment. Exquisite brought Han Sen to her ninth uncle. The man quite liked Han Sen, so he was happy about his visit. Uncle Nine seemed like a pleasant man, but when he heard Han Sen's story, his face went totally grim. Chapter 2753 God's Curse. Uncle Nine looked at Han Sen's piece of blood coral for a long while in silence. When he finally spoke, he sounded very serious. We need to go see the leader at once. Bring your coral with us. Han Sen and Exquisite were shocked. Uncle Nine's very high sense was at a very high level, so the chances of him getting emotional were very low. But now he looked rather shaken. Not saying anything further, he took Han Sen and Exquisite and headed to see the leader. Clearly, this was a matter of some importance. Uncle Nine, is Han Sen in a dangerous situation? Exquisite couldn't help but ask. Uncle Nine nodded and said, We will talk about it when we reach the leader. This is a very serious matter. If we don't sort this out correctly, it could have terrible consequences. After that, Uncle Nine didn't wait for a response from either Han Sen or Exquisite. He rolled up his sleeves and teleported away with both of them. Old Nine, what brings you here? Why the rush? The Very High leader was resting on a rocking chair inside a wooden tower. When he saw Uncle Nine bring Han Sen and Exquisite into his wooden home, he frowned. Instead of explaining, Uncle Nine merely pointed to Han Sen and the blood coral and said, Leader, look at his body. The Very High leader was confused, but when he saw the blood coral and Han Sen's scales, his face changed. He was the leader of the entire race, but he shot to his feet in surprise. His eyes widened as he stared at Han Sen and the blood coral. He couldn't even blink. Han Sen now knew for sure that this would be a very troublesome affair. If even the Very High leader was showing such a strong reaction, that meant the situation was already very serious. Far more so than Han Sen had initially believed. Han Sen was going to ask what was going on, but Uncle Nine already opened his mouth to inquire. Leader, is this what I think it is? The Very High leader nodded his head heavily. After a while, he spoke in a distant tone of voice. I can't believe it has happened. Upon hearing the Very High leader's confirmation, Uncle Nine's face looked even dour. What should we do? He asked the Very High leader seriously, looking at Han Sr. We must suppress this. We can't take any chances. The Very High leader responded without hesitation. Sir, what is wrong with Han Sen? Exquisite asked, now deeply worried about what was going on. The Very High leader and Uncle Nine stared silently at Han Senator. After a pause, the Very High leader said, This is something that began in the Sacred Era. Back then, the Very High were not so grand and famous, and the sky had yet to splinter from us. The strongest race in the universe was Sacred, and Sacred was also the strongest faction. The Very High leader paused, and his expression was unreadable. According to our historical records, a disaster struck our race. It prompted us to ask Sacred for their help. In response, Sacred sent an elite to outer sky to help us overcome the challenge. But for some reason, the elite of Sacred died in the buried dragon sea. Is whatever is happening to me related to the Sacred elite? Han Sen asked. Sacred leader nodded and said, That elite sacrificed himself to help us out of the disaster, but he was cursed by his opponent due to his actions. Han Sen's eyes narrowed and he asked, If that elite is dead, why does the curse still exist? Our ancestors thought that the matter came to a close when the Sacred elite was killed, but evidently they were wrong. Your body is growing scales. That means the curse didn't end with the sacred elite's death, Uncle Nine answered, pointing to the blood coral and the scales on Han Sr. What kind of curse is this? Exquisite asked with worry. The very high leader and Uncle Nine looked at each other. Uncle Nine sighed and said, the curse proclaimed that after the sacred elite died, he would someday rise again. He would become a monster that only knew how to kill. Our ancestors believed the sacred elite was completely destroyed, far too damaged to be revived. They thought the calamity was over, but the very high leader trailed off, looking at Han Sen's blood coral. After a while he said, but the blood coral you are holding is just like the Geno armament wielded by the sacred elite. The scales you are growing look just like his scale armor. That sacred elite might end up being reborn through your body. That is the nature of the curse. Is there no way to erase this infection? Han Sen wasn't excited about this news at all. Very high leader and Uncle Nine shook their heads apprehensively. Exquisite quickly said, Mr. Leader, with your power, there must be something you can do. Please save Han Sr. The very high leader sighed and said, I'm not remaining inactive because I don't want to help. I really can't. The scary being that cursed the sacred elite was a real god. That sacred elite fought that god. When the god was chased away, the toxic curse came into effect. It cannot be removed with our power. A god cursed the sacred elite? Han Sen asked, his heart suddenly pounding. The very high leader said, maybe you don't believe this universe has gods, but they do exist. Most ordinary creatures cannot see them. I believe in gods. What was this god called? And what was that sacred elite's name? Han Sen asked the very high leader, trying to keep his excitement under wraps. I don't know much about what happened. Not much detail was recorded about that fight. It appears that someone tried to erase the details of it. We only know that the fight was called God's Disaster, and that the sacred elite was named Dragon. Those are the only details we have. The very high leader looked at Han Sen and said, if Dragon's power is being reborn through you, then we will have to suppress you. If the curse is real, then we can't allow you to become a killing monster that might destroy the universe. Dragon's power might not end up being reborn through Han Sen's body. Maybe the whole reborn thing means Dragon himself. Didn't Han Sen say that the blood coral forest contains the carcass of a monster? Maybe that is the real dragon, Exquisite quickly suggested. The very high leader nodded and said, that coral forest and the body down below will be suppressed as well. Han Sen didn't think things were going too well. The very high were planning to lock him up like an animal. Mr. Leader, I might be infected, but perhaps there is a way for me to save myself. The very high have many elites, so there has to be a way to remove these small things from my body, Han Sen said quickly. We will try our best, but if nothing works, we might have to lock you up to prevent something very bad from happening. The very high leader was a very logical man. Like most very high, he didn't get emotional when he faced a crisis. He sorted out problems in the most efficient way that he could. Han Sen knew that right now, he was like a patient who had a very contagious disease. The best way to deal with it was to quarantine him. The very high leader was right. But Han Sen didn't see being locked in a cage as an acceptable solution. He felt very upset. 2754 The hope to break free. Uncle Nine sent Han Sen to a palace, and the very high leader began gathering an army of very high elites to go to the buried Dragon Sea. They planned to suppress the blood coral and uncover what was buried beneath it. Han Sen didn't know how they were going to suppress the blood coral and the thing below it. But 4 days later, the elite warriors began to gather in the very high leader's palace. When the last of them arrived, there were 4 true god elites and a dozen butterflies. It was a very powerful team. They investigated Han Sen's scales before they left, but sadly, every attempt to remove the scales failed. They even tried peeling off Han Sen's skin, but nothing seemed to work. The scales remained firmly in place. Han Sen's flesh could be sliced off, but when his flesh regrew, so did the scales. The very high couldn't do anything about Han Sen's mutation. Things seemed to be going very poorly for him. And of course, the very high decided to suppress Han Sen as well as the blood coral, just in case the curse turned out to be true. Nobody wanted Han Sen to turn into a monster, that could bring ruin and destruction to the entire universe. Han Sun hated the idea of being put in a cage, but he knew this was the best way for them to go about it. Even though the Very High were known for their brutal efficiency, they didn't simply kill him. Killing him would have been the most surefire way of dealing with the situation, and Han Sun had expected them to consider it as an option. He was rather relieved when he found out that they weren't planning to end him permanently. They left Han Sun in a palace surrounded by clouds and mist, and he had settled himself on the stairs that led to the palace's front door. He stared off into the clouds, his mind distant. Although the palace looked like an ordinary building, in truth, the entire place was contained inside a very high true god item. Han Sun had seen the true god item, which was a jade bottle of sorts, but he hadn't learned much about it. He had been taken in front of the Very High Alpha's statue, and then put inside the bottle. Although the clouds that surrounded his palace were beautiful, the place was still just a prison. Furthermore, the prison contained only him. Everything aside from the palace was just a blur. There were no life forces to examine, and the place seemed to be disconnected from the rest of the universe, too. In fact, Han Sun couldn't even continue practicing. If the Very High cannot find a way to remove my scales, does that mean I will be trapped here forever? Han Sen's face grew more distraught with every minute that passed. Although the strange piece of blood coral had been moved elsewhere by the Very High, and no longer reappeared next to Han Sun, the scales continued to grow across his body. Right now, most of his body had been claimed by the scales. Aside from his head not having horns, he looked like some sort of humanoid dragon beast. The palace contained food and fresh spring water, but it only satiated his hunger and kept him alive. It didn't allow him to practice more, and it did nothing to reinforce his genes. In the beginning, the Very High elites would visit now and again. They would also try out new methods to remove his scales, but they failed every time. As time passed, they visited less and less often. As Han Sun sat on the steps, it had been 10 days since he last saw any of the Very High elites. Right now, the Very High weren't helping Han Senator, they had become his oppressors. They couldn't confirm that Han Sun was dragon reborn via the curse, but in their usual style, the Very High had opted to trap him there. Because there was a small possibility that he could be destructive, they wouldn't let him leave. The Very High promised me that they would send Bauer to Sky Palace. I suppose they will do that for me at least. Now it is all down to me. I need to figure out a way to escape. Han Sun made many attempts, but they all seemed useless. The palace was completely cut off from the outside world. He couldn't even jump to a sanctuary. He couldn't go to the god area or anywhere else either. That place was like a giant prison. He wasn't really living, nor was he actually dying. He was just there. He was trapped. How can I be this unlucky? Han Sun sighed. Then an idea flashed through his head, and he said, "Right, maybe I can try this." Han Sun's heart jumped. He ran into the palace and closed the gate. Han Sun had been there for a while, so he knew roughly how the bottle worked. Because the world inside the bottle was completely separate from the outside world, it was impossible to see in or out. Unless the Very High came in person to visit, they wouldn't be able to see what he was doing. Han Sun had already tested this before, so he was certain that was the case. Once Han Sun had locked himself in the palace, he summoned something from Destiny's Tower. It was a bronze object that was a few meters tall. A sheep head marked each of the bronze object's 4 corners, and the entire thing looked rather evil. One of the sheep heads can send me to the world that trapped the Break Sky Alpha. I wonder if the other 3 sheep heads do the same thing. Or can they take me elsewhere? This thing was capable of transporting me away from outer sky, so perhaps it will still work here. Han Sun gritted his teeth. He went to one of the sheep heads on the 4 sheep cube. With a silent prayer, he placed his hand on the sheep head. The sheep head lowered under the force of Han Sen's hand. The black and white fish in the center of the object began to swim faster. Their speed formed a vortex within the water. Han Sun felt a force of suction attempt to pull his body into the swirl. He was surprised that it had actually worked. He didn't know where the 4 sheep cube would take him, but no matter where it was a chance to get free. He didn't want to remain in the palace forever. When Han Sun emerged from the water, he knew immediately that he was no longer in the palace. Han's son was afraid of exposing the scales on his skin, so he immediately put on his Dongxian armor. Even if a creature knew about Dongxian armor, they would just assume he was dollar. No one would know he had escaped from the very high true god item. What is this place? Han's son looked around in alarm. Moving as fast as he could, Han's son returned to the four-sheep cube. He slammed his hand down on the head of a sheep. Han's son was standing on a giant stone platform surrounded by scary stone xenogeniacs. To the east, there was a xenogeniac that was a white-haired, black-faced giant ape. To the south, there was a human-bodied monster with the head of a cow. To the north, there was a beast that was like a Kirin. To the west, there was a weird snake with 9 heads. The 4 giant xenogeniacs gave off a frightening presence. Sensing them sent chills right down Han's son's spine. The monsters surrounded the stone platform. Looming over it like the stone platform was a dinner table, and Han's son was the sole sausage in the middle that they would fight over. Pang! Han's son could see the white-haired, black-faced giant ape's hand stretching toward him. Han's son was already getting sucked into the four-sheep cube, and then his vision started to spin. When he emerged from the water, he was back in the palace contained within the very high's bottle. I'm fortunate that my reactions were quick. If I was too slow, I would have become food for those scary xenogeniacs. Han's son patted his chest and spoke to himself in a shaky voice, trying to comfort his frightened little heart. 2755 God's Farm. Han's son couldn't risk going back to that scary place. He looked at the 2 sheep heads he hadn't tried and said, "Why does the 4-sheep cube only send me to such weird and dangerous places?" The 4-sheep cube was Han's son's only chance of escape. He couldn't stop trying. He wouldn't give up hope until he had tried journeying to all 4 locations. Han's son gnashed his teeth as he pressed down another sheep head. The 4-sheep cube was activated again, and it sucked Han's son inside it. La! Han's son emerged from the 4-sheep cube, his body already tense. He immediately had a look around. Luckily, things were different from the last location. Here, no scary xenogeniacs were staring at him. This place looked fairly ordinary. Han's son was standing on an asteroid in an asteroid belt. He could see a lot of stars in the sky. There were very big stars all around him. Han's son looked at the stars and realized there were many planets nearby as well. He saw a planet with a life force. Looking a bit hesitant, Han's son flew down toward the planet. Holy shit! Is it a grass field? After Han's son entered the atmosphere, he was surprised to see that the entire surface of the planet seemed to be covered in a grassy field. He could see a lot of sheep grazing in those fields. They were all crowded together, and the smallest flock of sheep had at least 1,000 in their midst. The sheep were a variety of different colors and breeds. Most of them looked thin and swift like antelopes. Some of them were stock and powerful like goats. Some of them just looked like ordinary sheep. Did I fall into a sheep farm? It is a shame that cowardly sheep I met in the sanctuaries isn't here. He could translate for me and ask the sheep where this place is. Han's son could sense that the flocks of sheep were nothing mighty. The average sheep appeared to be no greater than Baron class. Even viscounts were rare. Han's son wasn't accustomed to being surrounded by such weak creatures. The other 2 sheep heads had sent Han's son to very dangerous places, but now, he was on a world of prey animals. He wasn't used to that. As Han's son flew down to land on the grass field, the flocks of sheep noticed him and raced to surround him. One of the sheep came forward to bleat at Han's son while he was in the sky. Bah! Han's son didn't speak sheepnese, so he activated the Dongxian area and used it to read the sheep's mind. He heard the sheep speak the universal language. It was saying to him, "Outsider, how did you come to God's farm?" It is good that it can speak, Han's son thought happily. He looked at the sheep and said, "I was lost in space, and I found this planet by chance. I was hoping you could tell me what this place is. If it is possible, can you sell me a star map?" When the flock of sheep heard what Han's son said, their response looked very human. They looked at each other, and then they started laughing. Han's son had never seen an enormous flock of sheep all laughing themselves silly. It was a very strange sight. He frowned and coldly said, "What is so funny?" One of the sheep laughed and said, "This is God's farm. We are the food that grows for God. Once you are here, You do not leave. You and I will become food for God together. I can come and go as I please. No one can keep me here, Han Sun said in annoyance. The flock looked at Han Sun with mirth. One of the sheep smirked and said, Try it now then. See if you can leave God's farm. This God's farm you keep talking about, do you mean the planet as a whole? Han Sun asked. Yes, the sheep affirmed with a nod. What is so hard about leaving here? Han Sun crouched, and then launched himself up into the sky like a rocket, intending to fly out of the atmosphere and leave that field-covered planet behind. He had almost exited the atmosphere when he saw the wind change. It suddenly came together to form a giant blade that slashed toward him as he flew. Han Sun's eyes narrowed. He generated a sword light in his hand and slashed toward the giant blade. Pang! The sword light came against the giant blade, and Han Sun felt a backlash of expended power wash over him. It knocked him out of the air. He fell back to the planet's surface, and he hit the ground so hard that he created a large crater. The giant blade disappeared as if it had never existed. Han Sun frowned up at the sky. The sheep were laughing. Since you are here, you should accept your fate. You will become food for God sooner or later. You must accept this. Han Sun didn't believe this was God's farm, unless God was the biggest fan of lamb shanks ever. If all God did was grow sheep, he would have smelled a lot more gamey. Han Sun turned his attention back to the sky and jumped into the air again. He was headed for the cosmos once more. When Han Sun was almost out of the atmosphere, the giant blade reappeared and slashed toward him. It is useless. Once you enter God's farm, you are God's food. No one can escape, the sheep proclaimed, shouting so that Han Sun could hear him. Pang! The next second, the eyes of all the sheep opened wide. They stared up in disbelief. Rather than attempting to dodge the blade, Han Sun punched it. His fist came against the big blade, and the blade broke. The blade shattered like a chunk of badly forged iron, and it disappeared in the air. If that was God's power, then God is pretty lame, Han Sun thought to himself. He was planning to fly back to the field, so that he could ask the sheep more questions about this place. But he suddenly saw many more blades appearing in the sky. A sea of swords rose before him, shielding the entire sky. They turned to point at Han. Senator Han Sun was shocked. He didn't say anything, and he just teleported back to the grass field. He raised his head and saw the countless blades that blanketed the sky start to disappear. They were gone within seconds. Han Sun's face turned grim. The power of a giant blade was as good as a primitive deified attack. If that many giant blades came down on him at once, not even Han Sun could block them. We told you this is God's farm. It doesn't matter how strong you are. In God's eye, you are just food, the sheep said with a smile. The God you are talking about, what does he look like? Han Sun said, ignoring the blathering of the brainwashed sheep. God is God. What else could he be? The sheep answered, looking at Han Sun with disdain. Han Sun wanted to ask something more, but he suddenly saw a carriage fly through the sky. 9 white unicorns were pulling a white carriage as it headed for the grassy field. When the flock of sheep saw the white carriage, they started to shake on the ground. It was like they didn't even have the power to run. It was all they could do to remain standing as they trembled. They lowered their heads, like they were ostriches that wanted nothing more than to put their heads in the sand. Chapter 2756. Butchering the flock of sheep. Han Sun looked around and remembered that he was on an endless grassy field. There was nowhere to hide, so instead of attempting to flee, he reduced his presence to hide inside the flock of sheep. The 9 white unicorns descended to the field, swooping down elegantly until the carriage touched down on the grass. Han Sun hid within the flock of sheep, but he kept his eyes pinned to the door of the carriage. He wondered what sort of scary being might be lurking within. It had to be something fierce if it was scaring the sheep this much. None of them dared to run, and they all remained rooted to the ground, shivering and shaking. The 9 unicorns finally came to a halt, and a drawn-out creak sounded as the door of the carriage opened. A small figure descended from the carriage, and Han Sun's brow furrowed. The person coming out of that carriage was a little girl. She looked to be no more than 10 years old. The scary being that the sheep all fear cannot be this little girl surely. Han Sun didn't take his eyes away from the carriage. He believed another creature would emerge behind the girl. She must be a servant or slave of some kind. But the carriage now seemed to be empty. The little girl was the only one to come out, and in her hands was a sharp knife. She moved toward a flock of sheep. Han Sun turned his attention back to the girl. Her body was undoubtedly that of a child, but for some reason, something about her eyes seemed a bit mature for her age. Is she a sky? Han Sun felt the presence of the girl, and he noticed there was a mark on her forehead. She might have been one of the sky. Either that or she was a very high. Although there were large cultural differences between them, in terms of simple physicality, the two races were practically the same. The very high simply had purer blood. The girl lifted the sharp knife before the flock. She reached out her hand towards a sheep's head and sighed. Little sheep, I have no choice but to do this. If you ever seek revenge, come for me. Don't take out your rage on someone else. After that, the sharp knife in the girl's hands was thrust forward. It slid straight into the heart of the sheep, and killed it in a single strike. Blood dribbled across the hilt of the knife, and gushed from the new cavity in the sheep's chest. The weird thing was the blood never had a chance to drip to the ground. As soon as the sheep's blood welled up, it was absorbed by the knife that killed it. In moments, the sheep's body had been sucked dry by the weapon. Under the draining powers of the knife, the sheep became a dried-up husk of its former self. The knife's color changed to a dark red, and it began to give off a very strong and bloody presence. Once the first sheep was dead, the girl moved on to another sheep. Every member of the flock was shivering violently, but they didn't dare to resist. The girl lifted her knife and thrust it through the next creature. Like the last, its blood was sucked dry. Han Sun was shocked at the sight. The girl continued killing the sheep, and not a single one of them tried to resist. It was like they were all queuing up to die, one after another. Soon, the death toll had reached 100 sheep. The blade of her knife had become as red as blood now. It looked like blood was going to begin dripping out of it any second. The strong coppery smell was awful. Han Sun could have detected the scent from a few miles away, and the smell was nauseating. There's definitely something wrong with that girl's knife, Han Sun murmured with a frown. He looked at the weapon in the little girl's hand. The girl's presence wasn't very strong, but there was something very frightening and strange about the aura of the sharp knife. It was much greater than the presence of the little girl herself. The little girl shouldn't have been capable of using such a powerful blade, but she was using it with finesse. The knife's power hadn't consumed her. This was a situation that Han Sun had never encountered before. Before he became deified, even Han Sun couldn't make use of 100% of a deified treasure's power. Yet the little girl was casually able to use a supremely sharp knife that was far greater than herself. Every strike she unleashed was lethal, and a sheep died each time she swung her hand. Everything about this situation was weird. This flock of sheep must be more afraid of the knife than the girl, Han Sun guessed to himself, but he still wasn't too sure what was going on. He kept staring at the sharp knife. It was a short knife that was composed of a wooden handle and a steel blade. The wooden handle was 7 inches long, but he couldn't determine what sort of wood it had been carved from. The handle was so darkly colored that it was almost black. The blade, on the other hand, was 1 foot long. It was shaped like a crescent moon. Because it had absorbed so much blood, it was gleaming red. It looked as if it was going to start gushing blood from its tip at any second. The girl didn't seem to be holding any sort of scabbard or sheath for the knife. Also, based on its shape, Han Sun surmised that the knife wasn't a combat weapon. It was more of a chef's knife or a butcher's tool. Suddenly, Han Sun felt a chill. Maybe it was because it had absorbed so much blood. But under the sunlight, Han Sun saw the blade expel some sort of bloody light. The bloody light rose, forming itself into the shadow of a red demon. The more sheep the girl killed, the more blood the demon could absorb. The blood demon grew scarier as more time passed. When that girl killed her 1,000 sheep, the shadow of the sharp knife had already generated a blood flame that was visible to the naked eye. Of course, the flock is afraid of the knife, not the little girl who is holding it. Still, this is such a strange situation. The girl is so weak. How can she wield such a potent weapon? And the sharp knife's power hasn't consumed her. Han Sun thought to himself as he observed the girl and her knife. Suddenly, Han Sen felt a chill run down his spine. He had been focusing too much on the knife, and the blood demon's shadow had discovered his existence. The shadowy body suddenly turned. The creature's eye sockets were empty aside from a pair of blood flames, and those fires now stared in Han Sen's direction. Before Han Sen could do anything, the sharp knife released a weird buzzing noise. Then the sharp knife started to fly, carrying the little girl's body along behind it. The weapon shot toward Han Sr. Han Sen could see the blood demon shadow clearly. It was opening its jaws, looking ready to devour him. The knife pulled the little girl straight toward Han Senator. The moment she saw him, she froze in surprise. Han Sen was prepared to fight, but the little girl's hand yanked back against the knife. Using all of her strength, the girl tried to keep the knife from heading for Han Sr. But her power was too small, and the sharp knife had a real lust for Han Senator. She wrapped both hands around the knife's handle and pulled as hard as she could, but her efforts were futile. She couldn't stop the knife. Her slim body was pulled steadily forward. Han Sen's frown deepened. He readied himself to fight, but the little girl gritted her teeth and pressed her hands down on the blade itself. The blade sliced into her hands, and the knife quickly absorbed the blood that welled up in her palms. Then the blade went quiet. The blood shadow demon was still visible above the blade, but it seemed to have been suppressed by some mystical power. The bloody light that formed the image of a red demon had dimmed slightly. No wonder she can use that sharp, weird knife. Something about her body is special. She must have some unusual connection to the knife, Han Sen thought to himself. Judging from the little girl's behavior, she didn't seem to be hostile toward Han Senator. He walked over to the girl and asked her, "Little girl, what is your name?" "Run. Leave here quickly," the little girl said in a rush, still keeping a white-knuckled grip on the knife. 2757 Growing knife. Why do I have to leave? Han Sen asked the little girl, planting his feet firmly on the ground. I can't control it much longer. It's going to kill you. Run, the little girl said, the panic in her voice growing. Han Sen looked at the little girl holding that knife. Her hands continued to bleed profusely. As her blood continued to flow the blade, the sharp knife's presence faded a little. It wasn't gone though. The knife's aura was still there, pressing out against the little girl's hand. It moaned gently. Han Sen knew that if the little girl stopped giving it blood, the knife would immediately go after him again. I'll leave then. Can you tell me how to exit this planet? And also, what is your name? Han Sen knew that if he stayed, he would only be causing the little girl more pain. He crouched down as he prepared to leap up into the sky. The little girl shook her head. I don't know. You just need to get away from here, as far as you possibly can. Fine. What is your name, though? Han Sen asked. Guwaner. You should leave now. Get as far away from here as you can, and don't come back until I am gone, the little girl said. Han Sen was ready to leave, but when he heard her name, his body went completely still. He looked at the little girl in shock, and he asked her, Your name is Guwana? Do you know Lone Bamboo? Han Sen remembered that Lone Bamboo had once mentioned his little sister was called Waner, because pray to God was taken away by God. It was an incident that the man was never able to let go. If Han Sen remembered things correctly, Lone Bamboo's sister was around 10 years old when she was taken away. It had been many years since then, so Guwaner should have been a grown-up. Finding her in a child's body was quite the surprise. You know my big brother. A sudden smile bloomed over Guwaner's face as she looked at Han Sr. I know him. We're good friends. Why are you here? What is this place? Han Sen glanced at Waner's sharp knife, then walked closer to her. He could have simply left if they were strangers. Now that he knew this little girl was Lone Bamboo's sister, though, he couldn't just leave. This is God's farm. It is like a buffet for God's knife. God brought me here to take care of the knife, Guwaner explained. Then she quickly asked, Is my big brother okay? Although Guwaner's explanation had been brief, Han Sen understood. She had been taken by God and brought her there. God had then given her this sharp knife and put her in charge of feeding it. God's knife ate by feasting on the blood of creatures. This place was called God's farm, but it was one of many. Many similar planets were in this system. and Gu Wanner had to follow a precise schedule. She took the blade to each planet at the right time, allowing God's knife to feed on a variety of different types of blood. Han Sun could immediately see that there were gaps in what Gu Wanner was telling him. She was hiding something. Aside from the blood of those xenogeneics, it also requires your blood, right? Han Sun asked, looking directly at Gu Wanner. Gu Wanner hesitated and forced a smile. Yes, I have to feed it some of my blood every day. But do not worry. I have an immortal body. When I sleep, my body recovers. That is fine with me. But about my brother, is he doing fine? If you leave this place, can you not tell him you saw me? No. Han Sun looked terrible. Although Gu Wanner spoke with little concern for herself, Han Sun knew that God had done something very cruel. God had brought Gu Wanner here and given her an immortal body, so she could use her blood to feed the knife. There was nothing godly about this knife. It was more like a depraved vampire. Gu Wanner had been made a slave who was forced to sacrifice her own blood. Every day, she needed to offer the demon her blood without rest. She couldn't even die. What do you mean by no? What happened to my brother? God promised me that if I helped him raise the knife, he would let my brother go on to live a good life. Gu Wanner paled, and she spoke more rapidly. Her body was so small, and it was obvious that she didn't have much blood to give. She had been bleeding for too long, and her body couldn't take it anymore. If you aren't there, the world means nothing to him. Han Sun walked in front of Gu Wanner, and he reached his hand out to the sharp knife. Give me the knife. No, no, no. You should leave now. It will kill you. Gu Wanner stepped back. Han Sun knew that Gu Wanner wasn't lying. When he first sensed the knife, he knew it was a ruthless weapon. That was why Han Sun had originally intended to leave. He didn't want to put himself at risk. But now that he knew that Lone Bamboo's sister was right here, and she was being tortured, he couldn't just turn his back on her and leave her to her fate. He had to try and help no matter the cost. He was hoping to take Gu Wanner away. It can't kill me. Moving fast, Han Sun slapped Gu Wanner's hands away from the knife. He stole the blood-sucking knife and clutched it in his hands. Gu Wanner's eyes widened when she saw that she was no longer holding the knife. She said, "Give it back to me quickly. This is God's knife. It is so scary, and it will kill you." Han Sun ignored Gu Wanner. He continued holding the knife by its handle, and he observed the blade carefully. Without Gu Wanner's blood, the crimson color of the metal was starting to fade. The demon-like shadow rose again. It was like a beast that would merrily feast on anyone it could. It turned to look at Han Senator. The blade began to tremble in his hands. Boom! When the sharp knife realized that Han Sun was holding it, a flash of bloody light shone around it. Han Sen's power was insufficient to maintain a grip on the knife, and it flew out of his hands. The demon shadow of the knife formed a body out of bloody flames. Its shape was roughly humanoid, but it seemed to be wreathed in fire. It rattled and shook as it held the sharp knife. The red, ghostly eyes peered at Han Sun, as if it wanted nothing more than to dine on his blood. Beastie! The bloody shadow moved. The sharp knife tore through space, carrying a bloody presence with it as it tried to attack Han Sr. Don't kill him! Gu Wanner shouted. She stepped in front of Han Sun, spreading her arms. Before the sharp knife got close enough to touch her, Han Sun grabbed the little girl and spun her around him. He threw a punch toward the sharp knife and said, "Remember, no matter when or where, girls should stay behind men and be protected. Don't try to get in the way of the man. You'll just get him hurt." Boom! While he was talking, the fist and the sharp knife struck each other. The bloody flame danced madly as the punching power was shattered. The resulting shockwave tore into the field around them, forming a giant crater. The nearby sheep were affected too. The explosion washed over them, reducing them to a bloody mist. Han Sun didn't fall back, but he felt something tear in his chest. He felt the urge to cough up a little blood, but he swallowed it back down. The knife roared, sounding like some terrible beast issuing a challenge. The next second, all four of Han Sen's Geno arts activated within his body. He combined with spell, and he entered his xenogeneic battle body mode. 2758 Every knife shows blood. Han Sen's xenogeneic body was covered by a black flame. He looked like a demon that had just crawled out of hell. He stared at the red demon that was holding a sharp knife. They looked like two lords of hell preparing to do battle. Stay away. This is the battleground of men. This is nothing for you to be involved in, Han Sun said over his shoulder, keeping his eyes on the red demon. After Han Sun combined his 4 genoarts, the Dongxian area's power increased exponentially. Han Sun discovered that this god's knife wasn't really a knife. It was a xenogeniac. Although it was a living creature, its body and soul were like knives. Han Sun didn't know the level of this xenogeniac, but its power was already beyond what Han Sun could accurately gauge. The blood demon's shadow stared at Han Sun coldly. The sharp knife in its hands glowed with a bloody light. The space around the knife was twisted by that bloody light, hiding the body of the knife. The only thing still visible through the twisted space was the knife light held by the glowing shadow of a hand. The next second the shadow moved. It traveled like a red mist beneath the sun. It was coming for Han Senator. The power in Han Sen's body exploded. He teleported behind the shadow and sent a punch toward the blood demon. But the blood demon looked as if it didn't know that Han Sun had already teleported away. Its knife was still headed for Han Sen's previous location. Han Sun was surprised that his opponent had been thrown off course by such a simple trick, but he continued with his strike. For him this was a good opportunity. He couldn't just stop mid-attack because of his suspicion. Catcha! But before Han Sen's fist hit the blood demon, his chest was cut open. A few of his ribs were sliced clean through, and some of his organs and crystallized blood were showing. What is going on? Why did I get hit? Han Sen's face contorted in sudden pain. He didn't understand how the creature had managed to hit him. The blood shadow hadn't turned around or even swung its knife toward Han Sun, but he had still been injured. This was so weird. There was no time to think. He summoned his immortal dragon, and it immediately released an immortal substance chained toward Han Sen's chest that healed Han Sen's wounds quickly. The blood demon moved forward and swung its knife at Han Sun in a crazed fury. Han Sun understood that his xenogeniac power was extremely inferior to that of the blood demon. He wanted to know how he had been hit, as well, so instead of attempting to block the attack, he used teleport again. But this time, he didn't teleport closer to the blood demon. He teleported away, trying to put some distance between his enemy and himself. Catcha! There was a space of 100 miles separating Han Sun and the blood demon, and the knife light wasn't slashing toward Han Senator. But even so, an invisible blade split Han Sen's head open. His skull cracked down the center, opening wide enough to show his pink brain. The pain of the attack was excruciating, and Han Sen's face turned white. I see. Although the attack had been brutal, Han Sun had learned something. He now understood how he had been hit. The bloody knife light had traveled to where Han Sun had previously been standing. There a very dim blood shadow had appeared. That blood shadow resembled Han Sen's face. The bloody knife light slashed that blood shadow, and Han Sen's body was injured by the blow. Is it a time or space power? Or is it a bit of both? Han Sen's wounds were healed by the immortal dragon's power. Not even such a grievous injury was going to kill him now. But the blood demon was clearly a scarier opponent than he had expected. Han Sun had already used Forever Solid on himself. Under the buffs of Forever Solid, even transmutation deifieds couldn't damage his xenogeniac battle body. Plus, the pesky dragon scales growing on his skin gave him an immunity power. He was indestructible. The bloody knife light wasn't physically striking his body, but it could still cut through his armor, scales, and bones. This was very frightening. The blood demon didn't seem to be putting as much thought into the situation as Han Sun was. Its face looked murderous as it came for him without hesitation. Wherever the knife light went, the space nearby was badly distorted. It was like many twisting bloodlights were dancing around the knife light. This time, Han Sun didn't try to teleport. Instead, he summoned his shield of the Medusa's gaze. He was going to block the blood demon's knife. The blood demon's power was strange, and trying to dodge it seemed to be useless. Han Sun had to block it, but the next second, Han Sun's chest was spilling blood. His entire body flew away. He hurtled through the air for a few miles. Then his body slammed into the field like an asteroid. Han Sun regained his senses in a giant circular hole. The armor on his chest had been cut open, revealing the flesh inside. His scales, bones, and ribs were cut in half. Han Sen's shield was still fine. Although the shield could stop all sorts of physical attacks, it was apparently unable to inhibit the knife light. That weird knife light phased through the shield like a ghost and struck Han Sen in the chest, completely unimpeded. The blood demon's body flashed, and it kept up an endless stream of attacks. No matter how Han Sen dodged or blocked, he couldn't manage to stop the blood demon's knife light. Every slash hit him, and Han Sen's god body bled as he incurred more and more knife-borne injuries. If not for the immortal dragon madly healing him as he fought, Han Sen would probably have been sliced to pieces a long time ago. Even so, there was a limit to how fast the immortal dragon could heal him. Its healing ability was beginning to lag behind the injuries Han Sen was receiving. Before Han Sen's wounds healed completely, he was hit a few more times. Powerful. Incredibly powerful. It is so powerful that fighting it makes one feel rather hopeless. Just run. You're going to get killed. Gu Wanner shouted from her position near the carriage. Countless shockwaves were being unleashed from Han Sen and the blood demon's fight, but the carriage wasn't taking any damage. It looked as if some magical power was protecting the vehicle in some capacity. Whenever a shockwave reached the carriage, it would fade. Han Sen wanted to run away too, but he couldn't. Even teleporting away was futile. He would still end up injured by the demon. And some sort of cruel restrictive power was locking this planet down. Entering was easy, but leaving would require Han Sen to somehow break through the Bysema. Not even his teleportation skills were enough. The knife's power was so weird. No matter what Han Sen did, he would end up being hit. The only good thing about this situation was that the blood demon's power couldn't kill him in a single blow. If it had been any stronger, he would have died before he even had a chance to fight back. Catcha! A slash struck Han Sen's body again. Han Sen couldn't even see how he had been injured. The blow almost severed his arm at the shoulder. Suddenly, Han Sen's body started to glow with blood light. Black scales grew like crazy, forcing their way through his armor. In seconds, the scales had wrapped all the way around Han Sen's body and through his armor. Before Han Sen figured out what was going on, he felt the ground shake. A blood light had shot down from space, and now it was gleaming in front of Han's senator. It was the blood coral that looked like a blood dragon. Chapter 2759 Reborn. Didn't the very high elders seal the blood coral? Why is it here now all of a sudden? Han Sen stared at the relic in surprise. He had used the 4-sheep cube to reach this place. How could a sealed chunk of coral make its way there? While Han Sen was still trying to figure out what was going on, his left arm started to move. It was like the blood in his arm was driving his muscles forward. Han Sen's brain definitely wasn't telling his arm to move, but his hand reached out to grip the blood coral anyway. Han Sen looked at his hand in consternation, but he couldn't stop it. His left hand gripped the part of the blood coral that looked like a dragon's head. That sacred elite isn't planning on using my body to be reborn, is he? Han Sen wondered. His body and the blood coral began to glow with a red light. The most frustrating thing was that this was the most critical moment of the fight. He was losing control of his body, and the demon was still coming toward him. It was going to kill him. Big brother, I understand that you're probably trying to take over my body, but can't it wait until later? Now is a bad time. To his surprise, Han Sen noticed that the blood demon wasn't attacking him. It stood some distance away, looking at Han Sen with confusion. Boom! Blood light surged from Han Sen's body, but the process was actually the reverse of his expectations. Instead of changing Han Sen, the light was leaving Han Sen's body and going toward the blood coral in his hands. The blood light sank into the blood coral, and Han Sen's black scales started to dull and thin. It was like he was devolving. What is going on? It isn't going to take over my body. Is it going to suck me dry instead? Han Sen looked at the blood coral. The dragon-shaped blood coral began to change as it absorbed the blood light coming from Han's senator. Oddly enough, the blood coral had lost its serpentine appearance and was now taking on a humanoid shape. No, it was taking on an actual human shape. The dragon head was becoming a human head, and long human arms were growing out of the body. The tail, however, still looked the same. As the blood coral changed, Han Sen's black scales quickly disappeared. Soon Han Sen looked normal again. It seemed like something had been pulled out of his body. Wait a minute. The shape of the blood coral looks rather familiar. Old Blood Dragon Lady. Isn't this what the Old Blood Dragon Lady looks like? It took Han Sen a minute, but he finally realized why the half-human, half-dragon shape of the blood coral looked so familiar. The blood coral now had a human head and a dragon tail. Dragon scales covered the being, and horns protruded from her head. The Old Blood Dragon Lady was the being that had been drawn on his back long ago. But the Old Blood Dragon Lady on his back had possessed silver scales, whereas this one had red scales. I understand now. I understand why the blood coral has been following me. It is because there are still remnants of the Old Blood Dragon Lady in the tattoo on my back. If the Old Blood Dragon Lady was the blood coral's master, that means she is using the Old Blood Dragon Lady drawing on my back to be reborn. The coral was never trying to claim my body at all, Han Sen thought, trying to logic his way through what was happening. Although Han Sen didn't entirely understand the events occurring around him, he could sense that his guesses were getting near to the truth. When the black scales on Han Sen's body disappeared completely, the blood coral became the Old Blood Dragon Lady. Her body hung silently in the air, her eyes closed. She looked like a statue. Sacred sent the Old Blood Dragon Lady to help out the very high. Now everything is explained. Han Sen's body was free once more. He looked at the Old Blood Dragon Lady in the air, but he didn't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. The blood demon didn't have Han Sen's patience. It saw that the Old Blood Dragon Lady was hanging motionless in the air like a dead statue, and the blood demon's flames exploded. The knife flew to attack the Old Blood Dragon Lady. Be careful, Han Sen shouted. It didn't seem the Old Blood Dragon Lady had woken up yet, and Han Sen was afraid for her. He channeled some of his power into the shout, trying to roust the Old Blood Dragon Lady. He didn't know if the Old Blood Dragon Lady was a friend or foe, but the blood demon was definitely an enemy. And as far as Han Sen was concerned, the enemy of his enemy was his friend. Right now, Han Sen hoped the Old Blood Dragon Lady wasn't going to wind up dead before she had woken up. The bloody knife light surged toward the Old Blood Dragon Lady, but her eyes remained closed. She didn't react to the incoming storm of destructive power. Han Sen knew how strong that knife was. Its attacks couldn't even be blocked. If the Old Blood Dragon Lady was struck without even being aware of its coming, there was no telling whether or not she could withstand the blow. At this time, the Old Blood Dragon Lady finally opened her eyes. Han Sen had never seen eyes like hers before. It was like stars were spinning around inside them. They held all the possibilities of a clear, open sky. Just looking into those eyes would be enough for most people to be conquered by their purity and greatness. Your eyes are my home for eternity. Han Sen had heard romantic things like that said before, but he had never understood what people meant. Until now. Looking into the Old Blood Dragon Lady's eyes, he understood. The Old Blood Dragon Lady calmly looked on the blood demon. As the knife light landed, she raised her arm. Her fingers that looked like jade were pointed forward. Boom! A beam of light as thin as a pen shot out of her finger. The force of it destroyed the bloody knife light and the blood demon shadow, revealing the sharp knife's real body. The sharp knife was struck, and it whirled away like a windmill. It hit the field, digging a hole into the turf. God knew how deep that hole was. So strong. Han Sen was shocked. The sharp knife was a strange xenogenic. It was probably larva class, or perhaps even stronger. The Old Blood Dragon Lady had annihilated it with only her finger. Based on that alone, it would be difficult to comprehend how scarily powerful she was. The sharp knife seemed to be quite resilient. Although the bloody flame shadow was destroyed, the blade itself hadn't been injured. BZD. In the blink of an eye, the sharp blade shot out of that bottomless pit. The blood flame surrounding it had gotten scarier. It generated a blood demon shadow once more, which grabbed the sharp knife and slashed toward the Old Blood Dragon Lady. The Old Blood Dragon Lady didn't move. She raised her finger and destroyed the bloody flame shadow surrounding the sharp knife again. The sharp knife generated bloody flames again and again, but the Old Blood Dragon Lady casually blew them all up. It made Han Sen's blood boil. This is an example of true power. No wonder the old blood dragon lady forced one of those people who call themselves God to fall back. She is so strong. Han Sen looked at the sharp knife that was still trying ceaselessly to reach the old blood dragon lady. Han Sen had to shout, "Big sister dragon lady, please blow up that knife." Pang! The sharp knife was struck by old blood dragon lady. The weapon flew a few hundred miles away, and a minute later, it was flying back. It was carrying its scary bloody flames. The terror still hadn't been stopped. Han Sen was going to keep cheering the old blood dragon lady on. But the old blood dragon lady's body froze. Suddenly she fell from the sky. She landed close to Han Sen, looking like blood coral again. Han Sen's eyes opened wide. He had been about to shout his support, but now there was no point. He was looking at the blood demon face to face. The atmosphere was quiet and tense. 2760 Super Space / the old blood dragon lady looked like she could raise some ancient forbidden power, then use it to destroy the sky and the earth. Just by lifting her hands or feet, she could defy terrifying enemies. But in reality, she was just a useless silver-faced sausage spearhead. After a few hits, she was done for, and she returned to looking like a mere chunk of blood coral. When the old blood dragon lady became blood coral again, her battle presence disappeared. It was like the first time Han Sen had seen a powerful enemy and thought that he lacked the strength to fight back. The blood shadow demon stared at the blood coral for a while, looking very confused. Its intelligence wasn't very impressive. Once it realized that it was no longer able to feel the presence of the blood coral, it turned away from the motionless item. With that enemy gone, it refocused its attention on Han Sen. Han Sen's stomach sank. He had thought a magical savior had come to help him and get rid of God's knife. But this was the measly result he had received. The appearance of old blood dragon lady hadn't been entirely useless though. At least old blood dragon lady had confirmed Han Sen's suspicions about God's knife. It was just a xenogenic. It was different from the beings that called themselves gods. This was just a creature that, with enough trial and error, could be beaten. Those gods cannot fight in the Geno universe, but God's knife can. So, it isn't the same thing as its masters. But for some reason, those gods have instructed Gu Wanner to raise this frightening xenogenic. That must mean that the creature isn't fully grown yet. I still have a chance of defeating it, Han Sen thought to himself. He wanted to figure out how to get rid of God's knife. Even old blood dragon lady's power wasn't enough to destroy the knife. The material of the blade was very unique, and its weird powers kept Han Sen from dodging its attacks. If it wasn't a strangely powerful being, a god wouldn't want to raise it. But old blood dragon lady already gave me a hint. Its knife light isn't entirely invincible. There is a way to break it. As Han Sen thought this through, the blood shadow demon lost its self-control and attacked again. A red mist flashed through the sky to teleport in front of Han Sen. Han Sen used teleport again to dodge. Just like the last time, he successfully avoided the knife light. Even so, when the knife light reached the place he had been standing moments before, a wound was opened in his chest again. That's it. This must be right. What he uses is a Geno art that is a combination of time and space powers. Han Sen had made that guess as he studied the fight between God's knife and old blood dragon lady. Now that he had experienced it again himself, he could turn those guesses into facts that could help him. The blood shadow demon was holding a sharp knife. It sent a crazy storm of blazing knife lights to attack Han Sen. Han Sen cast his 4 Geno arts to the max. His xenogenic battle body exploded with scary power. His teleportation and movements combined. But in the end, he still couldn't avoid that knife. Seeing another knife wound on his chest, Han Sen wasn't shocked. On the contrary, he was happy. That knife should have hit his head. But now, it had only struck his chest. That proved that his guess had been right, and his attempt to test that guess had been successful. He just hadn't yet gotten the timing spot on. A Geno art that can combine time and space. Its power can go through time and space. It slashed my body where it was in the past. Because it will always know where I was standing in the past. Attempting to dodge it will be futile. It will get me wherever I go. And it won't even have to chase after me to do so. As long as it can attack my past, I won't have to touch my actual body. It is a scary Geno art, a super space slash. Han Sen could see through the secrets that fueled God's knife power. But seeing through it was one thing. Being able to break, it was another thing entirely. Han Sen knew that this attack had many limitations. It could only slash the area of space and time shortly in the past. But Han Sen only managed to dodge it a few times, and God's knife only missed by a shave. He could not completely dodge the super space slash. If it wasn't for the immortal dragon that kept on healing Han Sen's body, he would have been slashed to pieces long ago. No, it still won't work. This was the hardest fight Han Sen had ever had to endure. He knew what his opponent's power was, but he couldn't break it. His body continued to accumulate injuries. Fortunately, Han Sen was able to dodge the most harmful blows, and the immortal dragon had sick healing power. God's knife wouldn't kill him anytime soon. Stop fighting. You need to go. You can't beat him. And he is going to kill you. You cannot die here. Gu Wanner was waiting far away near the carriage. She was crying as she yelled at Han Senator. Han Sen wanted to flee as well. But he couldn't leave that planet, so there was no point in trying to escape. He needed to deal with the trouble in front of him. Ha! Han Sen let out a raging roar. Countless knives and swords appeared in the air. The knife stream looked like a river in the sky as it poured down toward the blood shadow demon. Han Sen didn't think the knife stream could destroy God's knife. He just hoped it could imitate the old blood dragon lady's attack and disrupt the knife's power long enough to buy Han Sen some time. But Han Sen underestimated God's knife. The demon's knife light flashed, breaking the sky full of knife lights, and it continued toward Han Senator Blurg. The knife sank into the muscle of Han Sen's neck. It cut open his throat and blood spewed out. Han Sen had lost count of how many injuries he had sustained. Every spot in his body had been attacked by the knife. Han Sen had tried many different ways to evade God's knife's super space slash, but none had worked. Han Sen had even tried to make use of the Xian Yellow Sutra. He wanted to lower God's knife's level, but it didn't work. The Geno art couldn't touch the sharp knife's body. After Han Sen summoned the Xian Yellow Sutra power, the God's knife continued to slash his past self. It wouldn't connect with the power he had now. The immortal dragon kept healing Han Sen without looking tired. Han Sen was depending entirely on the immortal dragon's powerful healing abilities to keep him in the fight. Wanner, follow me. Han Sen teleported next to Wanner and summoned the Four-Sheep Cube. He was going to use the Four-Sheep Cube to escape that place and take Wanner to the very high. Even though that place was a jail, it was better than becoming food for a weird knife. I cannot go. You should leave here quickly. Gu Wanner shook her head. Her voice sounded certain. Han Sen wanted to ask why, but he was hit again. He screamed as he flew away. The blood shadow demon tried to chase after Han Sen, but Gu Wanner threw herself before the blood shadow demon. Han Sen looked on in shock. Fortunately, the blood shadow demon's knife light didn't cut her down. It didn't want to kill Wanner. It spun sideways through the air, trying to bypass Wanner and reach Han Senator, but Wanner stayed between them. She clutched the god's knife's blade, and the blood on her hands dyed the blade red. Blood poured out of the wounds in her hands. Within a second, Wanner's face became as pale as a piece of paper. Leave now. It still needs me. It will not kill me. Plus, I have an immortal body. I won't die. But you will die if you stay here. Wanner tightened her grip on the sharp knife as she shouted. She was clearly determined not to let it escape. 2761. A way to break eye in his palace inside the bottle. Han Sen's face was looking grim. He was sitting on the floor, frowning as he tried to think. He had never been as embarrassed as he was right then. He had needed a little girl to step in and save his life. If Gu Wanner hadn't stalled God's knife for him, he never would have had the chance to use the Four-Sheep Cube to escape. And he had even told Gu Wanner not to get in his way. But in the end, this was how things had turned out. He would never forget the expression on Gu Wanner's face when he had to leave her. I must find a way to defeat that crappy knife and bring Wanner back safely. Han Sen calmed himself and tried to think rationally. He knew feeling angry and embarrassed wasn't going to solve anything. He needed to find a way to sort out that so-called God's knife to save Gu Wanner. He needed to take her away from that place. If I use my super god spirit body, I shouldn't be harmed by super space slash. But even if Wanner and my super god spirit body didn't conflict with each other, my super god spirit body wouldn't last long. It couldn't support me long enough to defeat God's knife. So how can I block super space slash while not using super god spirit body? Plus, on top of that, just blocking super space slash isn't enough. I need to find a way to counter and break God's knife itself. Even Old Blood Dragon Lady was unable to destroy its body, and my power will be far weaker than what she was capable of generating. It will be even harder for me to destroy its body. Hansen wasn't going to give up just because of that though. He took time to calculate every possibility of what might transpire there. There was still a sliver of a chance he could succeed, one which he calculated to be 1:10,000, but that wasn't going to sway his firm resolve. The immortal dragon had been healing Hansen's body nonstop, but he had been taking too many injuries. When he was in God's farm, the immortal dragon could only heal each wound partially, leaving his body looking like a spider web of scars. That fight had injured him so much that he hadn't even known how badly he was injured. I can't change the past, so dodging is impossible. Unless I can erase the past. At that thought, Hansen's eyes brightened. Maybe I can try the Alpha's Sit and Forget Sutra. The Sit and Forget Sutra is about looking for a way for the body to disconnect from the universe, so the user can reside in a space that is outside of time and space. If a person's power is disconnected from the universe, then the blood demon will be unable to see me in the past. That abides by the rules of the universe. Hansen thought this was something he could try. He had the experience of the Alpha, so it wouldn't be difficult for him to practice the Sit and Forget Sutra. But even if the Sit and Forget Sutra could break super space slash, Hansen still had no way of destroying God's knife. This would only allow him to avoid losing for an indeterminate amount of time. Hansen couldn't think of a way in which he could destroy God's knife. But for now, he had a plan. First and foremost, he had to practice the Sit and Forget Sutra. He needed to see if he could break super space slash. Because he didn't have the very high sense as a base, Hansen could only use his Under the Sky as a base. He put the Sit and Forget Sutra into a part of the Under the Sky knife skill. It had been 2 weeks, and Hansen hadn't set one foot out of the palace. Ever since the Old Blood Dragon Lady appeared, Hansen's body had no longer grown any scales, and the blood coral hadn't so much as twitched in all that time either. If Hansen hadn't seen it become the Old Blood Dragon Lady, he would have thought it was just an ordinary lump of coral. It looks like the drop of the Old Blood Dragon Lady's blood that I have wasn't enough to support her full rebirth. But that is fine. I don't know if she is a friend or foe, and so this is likely the best result for now. Hansen looked at the chunk of blood coral next to him, and then he walked outside of the palace. For the past 2 weeks, he had been trying to let the Sit and Forget Sutra melt into his Under the Sky knife skills. But he had encountered a few problems he had been unable to overcome. He needed an idea or two, but there was nothing inspiring about that bottle palace. It was hard to come up with ideas. Hansen walked around the palace in circles. He still didn't understand, and he felt a bit annoyed. Although he understood that he had to be calm right now, the thought of Wanner and her situation was driving him insane. He couldn't keep calm. He brought out the siren bottle and summoned the Siren Virgin. He spoke to her, hoping to get some ideas from her. The results were very disappointing for Hansen once again though. The Siren Virgin had never seen the super space slash before, so she couldn't think of a way in which he might be able to break it. After the Siren Virgin spent half a day spouting useless crap that he didn't need to hear, Hansen had to put his foot down. He sent her back into the bottle and tossed her into storage. There was no one in that bottle palace to give Hansen advice. After hesitating for a while, he eventually decided to enter Destiny's Tower. He was going to see Ancient Devil, who had been trapped there for the longest time. Currently, Ancient Devil was the only prisoner that Hansen was keeping in Destiny's Tower. All the other creatures he once kept there had been sent to Purgatory Heaven a long time ago. Only Ancient Devil seemed too dangerous to be allowed to leave Destiny's Tower. "You need something from me?" Ancient Devil had been trapped there for a very long time, But he didn't look angry or restless like the average prisoner. It looked like he was on vacation, rather than trapped in an inescapable prison. Han Sun had to admire his attitude. If Han Sun had been trapped in there for so many years, he didn't think he would be so chill. I have encountered a creature that wields a super space/power. I don't know how to break it. Rather than trying to hide anything, Han Sun laid out what had happened as plain as could be. Ancient Devil's intelligence was remarkably high. He wasn't someone you could fool easily with a few lies. So Han Sun didn't even bother trying. That is easy. If you promise to let me go, I can teach you how to break it, Ancient Devil answered calmly. When he spoke about the conditions for his aid, he didn't sound excited about the prospect. Your powers are at the lowest tier of this universe, and my opponent is one of the most powerful beings in this reality. Do you really think I'm going to believe you? Han Sun asked coldly, staring at Ancient Devil. Yes. That is why you came, isn't it? Ancient Devil paused, and then went on to say, plus strength and knowledge don't go hand in hand. Time and space in this universe are the same as time and space in other places after all. They work the same here as they do in the sanctuaries. Super space/ works the same as well. The reasoning behind it is the same. If you understand that, you can find a way to break it. Then tell me, how would you break super space/? Han Sun asked. Agree to my conditions first, Ancient Devil shot back. You have to at least prove to me that you can really break the super space/power, Han Sun said, while looking expressionlessly at Ancient Devil. That Ancient Devil guy was too dangerous. Han Sun wouldn't let him out unless he had no other option. This had nothing to do with Ancient Devil's strength. The man was simply too scary. Even if he was just at a barren level, Han Sun wouldn't give him the chance to escape. Ancient Devil looked at Han Senator. He smiled and said, You just want to trick me. You want me to give you the solution, and then you can abandon your end of the bargain and keep me here. I don't think you're going to get what you want. Tell me something I have never heard about first, Han Sun said, his face unchanging. Ancient Devil was quick-witted. He did not keep saying that Han Sun wouldn't provide him his freedom. He fell silent, then said, According to theory, there is only one way to break super space/. What way is that? Han Sun said quickly. He had expected Ancient Devil to continue refusing to answer, but the man had replied startlingly fast. It is to kill yourself. Ancient Devil looked serious, and Han Sun could tell that the man meant what he said. But this was an answer that confused Han Sr. Chapter 2762 Dead yesterday, alive today. Are you serious? Han Sun thought Ancient Devil was playing with him. He couldn't imagine how killing himself would solve anything. Ancient Devil gave Han Sun a predatory grin. Haven't you heard about dying and then being reborn? If you don't die, how are you supposed to dodge super space/? Han Sun had heard of rebirth before, but he didn't know what it had to do with super space/. He wanted to find a way to counter super space/ because he wanted to live. What was the point of killing himself? Ancient Devil pointed at Han Sun and said, Before we all swore to die like it was yesterday, and after swore to live like today. Today you are still alive. Then, what is the difference if you were to die yesterday? As he listened to Ancient Devil, Han Sun felt like he was lost in an impenetrable fog. He had no idea what Ancient Devil was talking about, but he knew that continuing to ask wouldn't improve the situation. Unless he agreed to let Ancient Devil go, of course. Otherwise, Ancient Devil would continue to avoid reaching the crux of the matter and explaining what was required to break super space/. Although in truth, the hints that Han Sun had received thus far weren't all that bad. After leaving Destiny's Tower, Han Sun thought about what Ancient Devil had said to him. He still couldn't understand what the man was saying. Suicide and dying yesterday, being alive today. What is Ancient Devil trying to tell me? Han Sun spent a long time thinking the matter over, but he couldn't quite figure it out. It felt like the concept was just beyond reach. Suddenly, an invisible shockwave rolled through the air. Two shadows emerged from a quickly gathering mist, and they landed on the plaza of the palace. Exquisite and Liqueur are finally here. Han Sun exulted. Once he looked closer to confirm that it was them. Ever since he had been locked up in this bottle world, He hadn't seen hide nor hair of Likier or Exquisite. As both of them walked before him now, Han Sen didn't say anything. He knew Exquisite and Likier were only youngsters among the very high. They wouldn't be allowed to make any important decisions. Even if they wanted to free Han Sen, they didn't have the authority. The scales across your body are gone. Likier gasped, looking Han Sen over. Yes. I don't know why, but the scales just vanished. Can you ask the leader if I can leave now? Han Sen said. Exquisite and Likier looked at each other. It was as if they wanted to tell him something, but they were hesitant to actually say it. In the end, Exquisite ended up saying, the leader still wants you to stay in the bottle. Does that mean he's going to keep me bottled up in here forever? Han Sen said with a frown. Don't worry, Likier assured him. We will try our best to show everyone that you aren't a threat. We will try to get your freedom back as soon as possible. My body no longer possesses the scales. Doesn't that help erase any suspicions they have about me? Han Sen pointed out, but his voice didn't sound particularly hopeful. Exquisite sighed. If the scales had been removed by my people, of course, they wouldn't remain suspect. But now it seems that the scales have simply disappeared by themselves. I'm afraid the leader and the elders won't believe that the scales just vanished of their own accord and went away for good. That means I'm still to be trapped here. Han Sen's mind had become placid once again. He didn't expect the very high to let him go. He would have to escape using his own power. Likier tried to provide comfort by saying, we will try to help you in any way we can. You just need to hold out a little longer, okay? Han Sen wasn't a rookie who had only just started adventuring. He knew these were just words of comfort that wouldn't lead to any real changes in his situation. If I can't leave this place, can you bring me some books so that I'm not completely bored? Han Sen asked flatly. What kind of books would you like to read? In a situation like this, I don't think our people will let you read any kind of Geno art, Likier said, as straight as an arrow. She was often like that, telling Han Sen what he needed to know. No Geno arts. I just want some books about philosophy and theology. Something about life and death would be best. Han Sen was hoping that these books might give him inspiration, perhaps revealing what ancient devil meant when he spoke of suicide. Let me find a way. We will try and get these books for you, Likier answered. Thanks a lot. Han Sen smiled. You're our silkworm. This is what we should be doing. Likier trailed off halfway and fell silent. Han Sen's situation now was different. He wasn't really their silkworm anymore. But Han Sen seemed to be doing better than they had expected. The way he casually spoke with them, he didn't sound as if he was going to be locked up forever. Before they left, Exquisite told Han Sen, I will tell the leader that the scales have disappeared. They will most likely send someone to examine your condition, but I don't think there is a high chance of you leaving. So, do not put too much hope in getting out soon. I understand, Han Sen said with a nod. He knew Exquisite had no authority in this matter, so the final say-so wasn't her decision to make. Not long after they left, a very high true god elite appeared before Han Senator. He checked Han Sen out and asked Han Sen some questions. Han Sen had already composed his answers a long time ago, so when he was asked what had happened, he had a story ready to go. The explanation wasn't entirely perfect because Han Sen kept trying to avoid talking about certain things. The very high elder couldn't tell what was going on. After the very high elder left, no one came to see him for a few days. Han Sen spent the entire time practicing the Sit and Forget Sutra. Time passed rather easily. It has been a while since I saw Yanran and Linger. I wonder if Linger has grown up yet. And I wonder what is going on with Little Flower. Mom and Dad said they wanted to spend some time traveling. I wonder if they have come back yet. Sometimes, Han Sen would get distracted as he thought about how much he missed his family. The Sit and Forget Sutra is completely different from Under the Sky. One of them is about entering the world, and the other is about exiting the world. Combining them will be hard. And I have never practiced very high sense before, so I have to use Under the Sky as a base. If I start from the beginning with my practice, I don't know how long it will take for me to learn the Sit and Forget Sutra. Han Sen had no way of accurately predicting when he would elevate the new skill to a usable level. The Sit and Forget Sutra and Under the Sky were similar in structure, But according to the theory, they operated on different wavelengths. They were practically polar opposites. Even though he had managed to obtain the Alpha's experience in mind, he couldn't combine the two techniques. While Han Sun was stewing in his own frustration, a shadow appeared through the mist surrounding the palace. It was an old, very high man Han Sun wasn't familiar with. The old man didn't speak. He only tossed something at Han Sun, then turned around and left. Han Sun raised an eyebrow, having no clue what the old man had just done. He picked up the item and looked it over. It was a mini laptop, about the size of a person's hand. Han Sun turned on the computer. He couldn't connect to the internet, but there were many ebooks inside it. Now Han Sun understood. This was probably Li Qier and Exquisite's delivery. Han Sun browsed quickly through the titles, and he realized that ebooks really were the only things that the computer contained. Most of the books were about philosophy and theology. There wasn't anything about GenoArts at all. Han Sun hadn't really expected to find a GenoArt anyway. He flicked through the books. With how much his brain had evolved, it was an easy task for him to memorize the exact contents of a book with 1,000,000 words. He could recall the content perfectly, without forgetting a single word. Understanding it, however, was something else entirely. Flesh Real Sutra. Han Sun jerked when he saw the title of one of the books. 2763 Judgment. A second ago Han Sun had seen the Flesh Real Sutra before. But that time, the GenoArt had been written on a tablet. Han Sun hadn't understood it. To be more accurate, the GenoArt had been transcribed across many tablets, and Han Sun had only seen one part of it. According to legend, the Buddha had gained so much strength in recent times because they were researching the broken Flesh Real Sutra. That was how they had risen to such prominence in the universe. Many Buddha GenoArts had been developed from the Flesh Real Sutra. Even the shapeshifting skill that Burning Lamp Alpha once used to turn Han Sun into an ant had originated in the Flesh Real Sutra. This book must just happen to have the same name. This isn't the actual GenoArt, is it? Han Sun opened it to take a look. He scanned through the text, but it didn't seem to be a GenoArt. It was just a treatise involving concepts of theology and science. It was just like an ordinary theology book. The Flesh Real Sutra had so many vague and deep passages, it was difficult to even determine a correct interpretation of the GenoArt's contents. But Han Sun had a head start in understanding it. After all, he had once put a great deal of effort into studying the Dongxian Sutra. Now that hard work was paying dividends. Han Sun continued paging through the book, searching for something noteworthy. Nothing important jumped out at him, and the more he read, the less interested he became. After a while, the content became so boring that Han Sun was about to move on to a different manuscript. At that moment, Han Sun found an article that triggered his interest. It talked about there being more than one universe in existence. It was trying to say that the universe didn't exist alone. It was actually a part of a fabric containing many different universes. It was possible for creatures to travel between these universes. The concept was difficult to understand. It was like Han Sun was standing on a train, and the universe he inhabited was the carriage around him. However, if he walked forward into a different carriage, he would be in another universe. People weren't locked into the universes that they were born in. Throughout their lives, they flowed seamlessly from one universe into another, and most of the time, they didn't even realize that anything had changed. The divisions between universes weren't as obvious as a train that was partitioned into carriages. Universes were separated from each other by rules of time and space. The space you were in during one particular second would be different from the space you occupied in the next second. Based on this multiverse theory, it was logical that a person could go back in time or forward into the future. If there was only one universe, then a person would be locked into a single moment in time, and the past and future would remain forever out of reach. But if reality actually existed as a multiverse, then time could be altered. If a parallel universe existed in the past or the future, then it would be possible to go there. Of course, the Flesh Real Sutra didn't give any clear instructions on how Han Sun could go forward and backward in the multiverse. But the theory did provide Han Sun with some inspiration. According to the theory, Super Space Slash's power could slash through one universe and reach the next. So, even though Han's son could see a knife light, he couldn't block the knife light. Therefore, he couldn't dodge it. That was because the attack was actually landing in a previous universe, and Han's son was only being injured as a sort of after effect. If I use my body to block God's knife's power in the last universe, then I won't get hurt in the present. Like when I use Super God Spirit Body. No matter what time or universe I might be in, God's knife's power cannot hurt me. But the problem is the Super God Spirit Body is limited right now. Even if I could use it, I'd just end up in a stalemate with God's knife, unless I could find some way to destroy it. When my time with Super God Spirit Body expired, the fight would be over. I'd lose. Han's son continued talking to himself. It isn't like there is no other way. My body cannot withstand God's knife. But Super Space Slash's power doesn't seem to be complete. It cannot choose which universe it slashes into. He can only slash the universe 1 second before. If I could only predict the creature's attacks a second before they land, I could block. But God's knife continues to grow, and its attacks might no longer be limited to a second before. It would be immensely difficult to predict where an attack was coming from. And if God's knife continues to develop, it will become even more difficult. Plus, God's knife can see where I've moved in the following second. No matter what my defense is, the beast can choose to avoid my defensive position and target whichever weak point of mine it wishes to attack. If I can learn the Sit and Forget Sutra, I can cut off my connection to the past. Even if the me in the last universe was killed, then the me in the present wouldn't be affected. That would be the best case scenario. But the Sit and Forget Sutra and Under the Sky are in conflict. They cannot be practiced together. So if I want to block Super Space Slash, I have to predict the attack's direction a second before it is unleashed. Maybe I can use the Shield of the Medusa's Gaze to block the attack? That would be difficult. But it isn't as if I cannot do it. Judgment and formation talents are what I am best at after all. Under the Sky is the top Geno art for those who excel in those skills. Maybe I can really predict 1 second before. But now, the biggest problem is how to allow God's knife to see my movement and still keep it from hitting a vulnerable point. The Sit and Forget Sutra couldn't be combined with Under the Sky, and he couldn't understand what Ancient Devil was talking about. Instead of worrying about both problems at once, Han's son focused on practicing Under the Sky to see if he could predict the actions of someone 1 second in advance. God's knife could predict what would happen 1 second in the future, and so Han's son had to learn the future that God's knife already knew. Somehow, he had to force his opponent to attack his shield, rather than his vulnerable flesh. It was an incredibly difficult challenge. Ordinary people couldn't fathom doing such a thing. But Han's son didn't believe it was an impossible task. Super Space Slash was only one skill. It must be breakable. The fight would be something like a game of chess. Every time Han's son moved, it would alter his opponent's response. Checkmate was achieved by pushing his opponent into a place where none of his options were good ones. But that thought led to another difficulty. In chess, a player had to attack their opponent's weakness. In order to limit his opponent's options, Han's son would need to threaten him. If the threat level wasn't high enough, God's knife could just ignore Han's son's provocation. God's knife is so durable, even old Blood Dragon Lady couldn't destroy his body. I don't have a strong enough weapon, and my personal power hasn't reached such a godly level. But even if I can't kill God's knife, if I can just rattle it, I might stand a chance. Han's son was so excited thinking about this. He finally had an idea. Han's son's strongest skill was Super Spank. In addition, he had Break 6 Skies and Heart Connection. The levels and powers of each skill were different. Super Spank wasn't powerful enough to shatter the substance chains of God's knife. So right now it wasn't useful. Heart Connection's penetration power was strong, but against God's knife's strong body, it would be useless. The explosive power of Break 6 Skies, however, was perfect for Han's son's situation. Chapter 2764 Walk Your Own Path. In the days that followed, Han's son didn't eat or drink much. He spent all his time modifying Under the Sky and Break 6 Skies, Under the Sky wasn't very compatible with Break 6 skies. So Han Sun would have to use his dual pistols from spell to channel the power. And Break 6 skies had to be modified as well. He might not be using the Geno Art's full destructive capability, but the explosive power had to be sufficient to annihilate God's knife. Only by doing that could Han Sun perform his 1-second judgment into the past. This was a very big project. Han Sun focused all his attention on modifying the skills. He wanted to make the technique as perfect as possible. God's knife was such a scary being. If there was the slightest flaw in his plan, Han Sun would lose the fight and die. But Han Sun was confident that he had what it took. Sooner or later, he'd make it work. Now that I have sorted out how to deal with the super space/problem, I must move on to the last problem that is standing in my way. How can I actually destroy God's knife? While Han Sun was practicing, he mulled over this next task. If he was unable to destroy God's knife, blocking super space/ was pointless. Reaching a stalemate would be the same as losing. Gu Wanner would remain trapped either way. But with Han Sun's current resources and power, he couldn't defeat God's knife. If I can't break it, then I must find a way to trap it. Maybe Turtle would be a good choice for that. But I just don't know if it will work on God's knife. Han Sun realized that his imagination alone wouldn't be enough to solve the problem. Whether he was attempting to predict his opponent's attack vector, or trying to determine the effectiveness of Turtle, he needed to perform real-world tests. He had to see how his plans worked out in proper combat. It looks like I still need to go to God's farm. I wonder if God's knife is still on the Demon Sheep planet? Once Han Sun finished modifying Under the Sky and Break 6 skies, he planned to go to God's farm. The path other people walk is the path for them. I have to walk my own path. Han Sun continued not to eat and drink, and he kept chipping away at his modifications to the Geno Arts. He didn't sleep or rest for 2 weeks. Every time he thought of Gu Wanner having to use her own blood to feed that knife every day, Han Sun's heart ached. Before the modification works were finished, Exquisite came back. But this time it was only her. Li Qier didn't join her. The leader still isn't willing to let me out? Han Sun asked, glancing at Li Qier. He was already prepared. Exquisite didn't answer Han Senator. She only coldly told him to follow her. Then she flew toward the mist. Han Sun was surprised. This was well beyond his wildest expectations. Exquisite was going to lead him out of the bottle. Han Sun had never expected the Very High to actually free him. But if he was able to leave there so easily, he wasn't going to hesitate or complain. He flew to catch up with Exquisite, and he followed her through the mist. Does the leader believe that I'm not cursed? Han Sun asked Exquisite. Don't say or ask anything. I've got this. You just need to be quiet and follow me. Exquisite said without even looking at him. Han Sun could feel there was something amiss here, but he didn't dare to speak again. He remained silent and followed after Exquisite. Exquisite guided the two of them through the mist, and they eventually emerged outside the bottle. The hall that held the bottle had such powerful restrictions that they didn't need a Very High to guard the place. Exquisite had used a small stamp to enter, and it kept the restrictions from affecting her. She led Han Sun out of the hall. After exiting the hall, Exquisite placed her hand on Han Sun's shoulder. She was going to teleport both of them away from that place. But Han Sun took her hand, stopping her from using Galaxy Teleport. Exquisite looked at Han Sun with confusion, and Han Sun looked back at her, with a very serious expression. In a quiet voice he said, "Answer my question. Are you taking me to the leader?" Exquisite hesitated a bit, but then she shook her head and said, "No." With that answer, Han Sun was almost certain that his guess was correct. He persisted and asked Exquisite, "The leader hasn't given you permission to take me out of the bottle world, has he?" "You don't need to concern yourself with such matters. I'm taking you away from Outer Sky. After you leave Outer Sky, you should go back to Sky Palace. Tell everything that happened here to Zhang Xiandao. If he is willing to keep you, I don't think our leader will try to take you back from Sky Palace," Exquisite said. Han Sun's expression became unreadable. He knew what was happening now. Exquisite was taking a huge risk. She was breaking the rules and setting him free on the sly. Han Sun had never expected that Exquisite might do something like this for him. Han Sun had only thought of Exquisite as a tool for accelerating his growth, but now, he couldn't consider her that way anymore. Why? Han Sun asked, giving Exquisite a complex look. You came into this place alive. I'm going to make sure you leave this place the same way, Exquisite said with an emotionless look. If I leave, what is going to happen to you? Han Sun knew the Very High's rules were strict. The Very High could be an extremely heartless people. If someone broke the rules, they wouldn't look on the transgression kindly. Nothing much will happen. All I have done is set my silkworm free. It isn't a big deal. And I have other things to do anyway. Stop wasting my time, Exquisite said coldly. Han Sun nodded and said, Yes. We really can't waste any time. Take me back to the bottle world. Exquisite froze. Then, she looked at Han Sun with confusion and asked, You don't want to leave? That is correct. If you had destroyed your contract with me, and trapped me in the bottle world and scolded me, someday I would put my knife to your neck, and leave this place by force. Han Sun paused, and then he went on to say, But if you let me go like this, I will feel very guilty. I cannot owe someone this much. Han Sun hadn't been with the Very High for very long, but he had taken the time to read their cruel rules. He knew what would happen if she let him go. She might not be killed, but she would be imprisoned for a century. Han Sun's personality wouldn't allow that to happen. He didn't mind fighting people. No matter how cruel the enemy was, he could find a way to kill them. But he was afraid of people treating him too kindly. He didn't want to owe anyone too much. Han Sun didn't know how he could pay back a woman who had wasted her youth on him. He didn't want Exquisite to be in jail on his behalf for 100 years. So he had no choice but to stay. Of course, Han Sun also had a plan. His situation wasn't hopeless. If it had been hopeless, he would have simply left and taken Exquisite with him. But he couldn't do that just yet, because Exquisite might not completely betray the Very High to be with him. So, Han Sun had to reject Exquisite's good intentions. You won't owe me anything. This isn't a big deal, Exquisite said to Han Sun casually. How can a century of jail time be considered nothing? How many centuries can you even live for? Han Sun asked. How did you know that? Exquisite was shocked. Send me back. Han Sun didn't answer. He calmly looked at Exquisite with soft eyes. You need to know that if you miss this chance, you risk being trapped inside the bottle's world forever. Exquisite looked at Han Sun with a conflicted expression. No, I will not. I will use my powers to leave. Nothing can trap me there, Han Sun said firmly. His face looked so confident, as if he was telling her that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Chapter 2765 Escape. Exquisite looked at Han Sun with a complicated expression. Her resolve had been firm when she decided to go against the rules and risk releasing Han Senator. She might not be jailed for 100 years, but she could still receive extremely dire punishments. But now Han Sun wasn't willing to leave, and he said he would use his powers to escape. Exquisite didn't know why Han Sun was so confident about this. To her, the things he said were mad. The bottle world was inside the hall of the Very High's Alpha. The restrictions there were extremely powerful. In all likelihood, not even a true god elite could access such a place without the Very High stamp that disarmed the restrictions. Han Sun was a man who had just become deified, and he was proudly announcing that he could use his own power to escape the Alpha's hall. But his certainty aside, he was still locked inside the bottle world. Anyone would think Han Sun was crazy for claiming to be capable of such a thing. You need to think about this. My offer now is your only chance, Exquisite said. Looking intently at Han Sr. Send me back. It will look bad if people find us here like this, Han Sun said calmly. Exquisite could feel what Han Sun was thinking, and she felt rather touched by it. He didn't want her to get dragged into so much trouble on his behalf. That was why he was so determined to return to the bottle. But Exquisite still didn't understand where Han Sun was getting his confidence. It was outlandish to think he could escape a true god prison of his own volition. Suddenly, Exquisite's face went blank. She sighed and said, Now it is too late for you to go. After that she stopped hesitating. She took Han Sun back to the Alpha's hall, and returned him to the bottle world. When Exquisite returned into the bottle with Han Sun, she found Uncle Nine waiting for her inside. He looked at Exquisite and frowned. Exquisite, come with me. Han Sun knew Uncle Nine must have found out that she had taken him away for a brief spell. It was fortunate that he didn't actually leave. Otherwise, the Very High would have considered Exquisite to be a criminal. Exquisite looked at Han Sun with a complex expression. Then she followed Uncle Nine to leave the bottle world. It looks like the Very High haven't found out that the blood coral has escaped their seal and come back to me. It's amazing that even their elders didn't notice it was gone. Han Sun was very curious about the blood coral, but although it seemed to be quite resilient, he couldn't use it as a weapon. It was just a vessel for old blood dragon lady's body. Han Sun continued to modify his Under the Sky and break 6 skies, until he couldn't think of any way to take them further. Then he found the time to go to God's farm again. Han Sun carefully entered God's farm, but he didn't see Gu Wanner or God's knife anywhere. The carriage that was pulled by 9 unicorns had also vanished. Gu Wanner should come back, right? Han Sun was no longer worried about his safety. He was worried about what had happened last time. The knife or its master might have decided to stop Wanner from coming to Demon Sheep Planet now. What is God's farm exactly? Is it a xenogenic space, or is it part of the normal universe? Han Sun realized he hadn't tried going back to the sanctuary from there. He knew the chances of it working were slim, but he didn't mind trying. But when he tested it, he really was transported back home. Even Han Sun was surprised, and he said, "If I can travel back here, that means God's farm is somewhere in the universe. It isn't a separate dimension like outer sky. If that is the case, then I will be free if I can escape the Demon Sheep Planet's restrictions." If Han Sun's only problem was being trapped inside the bottle world, this would have made him extremely happy. But now, even though he was free, he couldn't be happy because he had no way of saving Wanner. Should I tell Lone Bamboo about Wanner? But I don't know where to find God's farm, unless I travel to it using the 4-sheep cube. It is pointless to tell Lone Bamboo this. I need to figure it all out for myself first. Han Sun went back home. He saw his baby daughter Linger and felt much more relaxed. "My dear Linger, when Dad was not around, were you being naughty?" He held Linger in his arms. He kissed her on the cheek and smiled. Linger did behave. "Daddy didn't behave," Linger said with a blink. "Since when have I been a naughty boy?" Han Sun asked curiously. Linger looked at Ji Yanran, who was cooking in the kitchen. She quietly told Han Sun, "Daddy hasn't been back for a long time. It has made Mommy very angry." "How angry is she?" Han Sun quietly asked Linger. Linger held onto Han Sen's neck, placed her little mouth next to Han Sen's ear, and whispered in a voice that only the two of them would hear. "Mommy said she would teach you a lesson when you came back." Han Sun stayed at home for a few days. Every now and again, he would return to God's farm. He still hadn't seen Wanner or God's knife, and he didn't have any idea when they would return to the planet. "I can't just keep waiting like this. I guess it's time to see if I can break the defenses of Demon Sheep Planet." Han Sun looked up into the skies above him. He became a xenogeniac and flew up off the surface. Just like last time, as Han Sun was about to breach the atmosphere, countless knife lights manifested around him. Each attack dealt damage that was equivalent to the strike of a primitive deified elite. The sea of knife lights seemed endless. Han Sun could have ignored 1 or 2 of those knife lights, but he couldn't deal with them in the tens or hundreds. There were just too many of those knife lights. They swept toward him like a river, coming down on him without reprieve. Han Sun used his Medusa shield to fight back, and although the shield didn't break, the scary impacts knocked Han Sun down from the sky. He shot to the surface like a meteor, creating a huge impact crater when he hit the ground. Han Sun made several attempts to get past the planet's defenses, but he realized he couldn't escape the planet using brute force. Even larva-class deifieds wouldn't be able to break through the defensive net. If my super god spirit body wasn't being affected by Wanner, I could escape. I haven't been able to use super god spirit body for the longest time though. It only stays active for a few seconds, and I don't know if that would be enough time for me to escape. Now that he had exhausted his other options, Han Sun knew he'd have to give it a try. He lifted his shield and flew into the sky once more. When his body could no longer take the impact of the knife lights, he lowered the Medusa shield and activated his Super God Spirit mode. While he was in his invincible mode, Han Sun teleported. This attempt worked out much better than Han Sun had expected. His heart began to beat more quickly. He needed to teleport as far as he could in order to escape the planet's defenses. But when he teleported again, he lost track of how far he had traveled. When he emerged from the jump, he found himself in a strange part of the cosmos. After a while, he noticed located Demon Sheep Planet behind him. It was so distant that it appeared to be the size of his fist. It looked like little more than a small moon from here. His Super God Spirit mode came to an end. It had only lasted long enough for him to teleport once. As Han Sun looked around, he saw a group of people flying past. He looked closer, and he noticed a particular destroyed amongst them. It was Bar. Chapter 2766 Fair and Square Way Display $. Why are you here? Bar noticed Han Sun and recognized his Dongxian armor. If I said I was lost, would you believe me? Han Sun asked. Bar raised his eyebrows at the answer. He gave Han Sun a weird look and said, You are lost out here? What is this place? Han Sun asked. We're in an underdeveloped barren area. It isn't far from a large barren system. As for precisely where we are, I can't really tell you. After all, this place is mostly unexplored. There are no maps here, Bar said. Han Sun was shocked. He thought to himself, a big barren system? That means it most likely belonged to sacred and ancient times. It is an entrance to the sanctuaries. This was the place that old cat brought little flower. What are you doing in such a dangerous place? Han Sun asked Bar. This place isn't a large barren system, so it isn't too dangerous. It is just a poor system with few resources. But a small race here discovered a xenogenic space. They claimed they found something awesome here. That is why I have come out here to look. Bar looked at Han Sun and said, Are you interested in visiting this xenogenic space to check? Han Sun didn't answer. The few deified elites that were accompanying Bar approached him. One of them smiled and said, Bar, why don't you introduce us to this friend of yours? This is the human called $. He was the Marquis winner of the last Geno being scroll. Bar explained to the deified, his voice carrying a modicum of respect. He was quite polite to this other destroyed. After that, Bar pointed at the deified elite and said, $, this is the destroyed's transmutation deified. He is Elder Nader. Bar didn't introduce the other people around Elder Nader. He only said they were students of Elder Nader. They were all just kings or half-deifieds. Bar himself was already deified, and he couldn't be bothered to introduce them all. Elder Nader could see that Bar was being very friendly to Han Senator. He thought Han Sun had to be an elite from some big race, but he was just some scion of a smaller race. The man swiftly lost interest, and he only addressed the occasional casual remark toward Han Senator $, had reached first place in the Marquis Geno being scroll. But Marquises were very different from deifieds. Nader thought he had no reason to take a deified that came from a small race seriously. Although it was difficult to become deified, the smaller races occasionally got lucky. They might stumble upon a treasure, or get their hands on a resource from a stronger race, and become deified. But deifieds like that always had a bad base. They lacked knowledge and practical skills, and they were likely to cause trouble. The destroyed had previously adopted a few deifieds like that, but showing such benevolence had never worked out well for the destroyed. The deifieds did little to benefit the destroyed, and instead, they were a frequent pain in the ass for their host race. Ever since then, the destroyed had stopped recruiting deifieds from smaller races. They would rather raise their own elites. If Han Sun had been from a big race, Elder Nader would have liked to talk to him. But after learning who $, was, he was no longer interested. Elder Nader might not take Han Sun seriously, but Bar knew about $, through Diarabber. Even Diarabber really admired the elusive $, so Bar would never think about underestimating him. Brother $, if there is nothing else for you to do here, how about you come with us to explore that xenogenic space? Bar said, inviting Han Sun along again. We can explore together, but if we get something good, how will we split it? Han Sun wasn't really interested in a xenogenic space, But he didn't know much about this system. Following Bar and the others might save him from some trouble in the future. Elder Nader is a transmutation deified. He has the most power here. He will take 60% of the goods. How about we split the other 40% between you and me? Bar suggested after a moment of silence. Elder Nader wasn't very happy about that proposition. In his eyes, Dollar was just a primitive deified. 20% was too much, he believed. Dollar shouldn't receive any more than 10%. But since Bar had already made the offer, Elder Nader wasn't going to embarrass the man by stepping on his toes. He remained quiet. Han Sun shook his head. That isn't very fair. Never mind. Brother Dollar, how would you suggest we split it? You can tell us. Bar knew this adventure would be dangerous. Having an elite like Dollar would benefit their mission quite a bit. I'm always very fair. If this is a cooperation, I think we should split the rewards 50-50ths. The destroyed get 50, and the humans get 50, Han Sun said seriously. Fury swept through Elder Nader and his students, and they wanted to burst out crying and laughing at the same time. He had already been a little upset about the prospect of Han Sun receiving 20%, but he knew that discovering a new xenogenic space could be a dangerous and weird adventure. Enlisting the help of an extra deified was a good idea. He wouldn't have agreed to the 20% offer if he hadn't understood that having Han Sun along could prove useful. But now, Han Sun wanted 50% of the total goods. That was too ridiculous. Small races have their diminutive status for a reason. After becoming deified, they do tend to become full of themselves. I'm afraid he doesn't even know the difference between a primitive deified and a transmutation deified. And he wants to split the goods 50-50? Elder Nader was angered by the suggestion. He looked at Han Sun and snorted. If you were a larva deified, I would consider 50-50ths. I am primitive. I will only accept 50-50ths. Han Sun stood his ground. Even though he was only primitive, his body was incredibly strong, and he had studied many genoarts. Even ordinary transmutation deifieds couldn't really defeat Han Senator, so Han Sun believed 50-50 was fair. But Elder Nader was not of the same opinion. After hearing Han Sun, he laughed. Your stomach is too big. We can't feed you. In that case, I have to go, Han Sun said. Then, he turned to Bar and told him, Brother Bar, do you have a star map I can purchase? I would really appreciate it if you could sell one to me. It is just a star map. It isn't worth much. Just take it if you need it. Bar opened his communicator and sent the star map to Han Sr. Thanks a lot. We will meet again, Brother Bar. Han Sun accepted it and nodded his thanks. Seeing Han Sun leave, one of Elder Nader's students laughed. He really doesn't know his place. He thinks that becoming deified has made him invincible in the universe. A deified like him, who doesn't know his place, is as insubstantial as smoke. There is nothing for him to be cocky about. Yeah, he is just a primitive deified. Our master could squeeze him to death with one hand. Why be so polite to him? I am afraid he doesn't understand how much difference there is between a primitive and a transmutation. That is why he was so confident. Master, you should take this into your own hands and show him who the boss is. Who gave him the confidence to suggest going 50-50 with the master? The students kept talking and judging Han Senator. They sounded as if they were all stronger than Han Senator. They had clearly forgotten that they were all kings, and Han Sun was deified. (2767) A xenogenic space that seems familiar. Han Sun kept flying. As he went, he examined his star map. A quick perusal of the star map confirmed that the system he was currently in was near a big barren system. It is a shame they aren't exploring the big barren system. Otherwise, I would have gone with them for free, Han Sun said to himself. But not long after, he encountered someone he was familiar with once again. He saw Dragon 1 flying quickly toward him. Dollar! Dragon 1 screamed in shock. Upon seeing Dollar, the man had recognized him immediately. Han Sun had no choice but to talk to Dragon 1. Dragon 1 was headed toward the xenogenic space, but something must have happened to the dragon race, because he was going alone. Brother Dollar, Are you interested in exploring a xenogenic space with me? Dragon 1 thought the same thing as Bar. People like Han Sun were good to have as allies when you were going someplace dangerous. We can go together, but if we do, we must split the rewards 50-50, Han Sun said immediately, not wanting to waste time beating around the bush. Dragon 1 didn't hesitate. He smiled. Of course, once Dragon 1 had agreed to Han Sun's request, he explained the situation inside the xenogenic space. Because it was near the Big Barren system, and it was largely unexplored, not many of the high races went there. So this place had been taken over by a lower race known as the Red Rats. The Red Rats were a small race, and the strongest of them were only king class. They didn't even have a half-deified in their midst. There weren't many xenogenics in that system, so they had always been fine. But in more recent times, a star had exploded in the system. The explosion had turned out to have important ramifications for the Red Rats. After the star exploded, the Red Rats discovered, to their shock, that the star had hidden the entrance to a xenogenic space. The Red Rats were happy about this, and so they sent people to explore the xenogenic space. But then something happened. 100 million Red Rats had gone to explore that xenogenic space, but only one Red Rat made it back. The other Red Rats perished someplace inside. According to the Red Rat that survived, the xenogenic space was a very spooky place. It was like there were countless suns hanging in there. The xenogenic space was very hot and scary. They tried to get close to one of the suns, but the sun suddenly exploded. Millions of the Red Rats were turned into dust. Only that one Red Rat made it back, but it didn't even know why it had been spared. By all logic, it should have died in the explosion like the other Red Rats. The survivor was only a small viscount too. It wasn't any stronger than the 100 million Red Rats that had died. Since no marquises had survived, it was hard to imagine how he managed to make it out. And then a few days later, that lucky Red Rat evolved. It went from Viscount to Earl. And then it continued leveling up. This sudden evolution was shocking for everyone. When Dragon 1 arrived, the creature had just become king class. The situation was so weird, and the strange Red Rat had garnered the attention of every race. They wanted to figure out what spurred the creature's swift evolution. They wondered what sort of benefit the Red Rat had managed to get his hands on inside the xenogenic space. He had been evolving at an unbelievable rate. Many races had sent their low-level people into the xenogenic space, but none of those teams had been heard from again. So all the races were now forced to send their deified elites to check the place out. After hearing Dragon 1 explain all this, Han Sun's curiosity was piqued. He also wanted to know why the Red Rat had evolved so quickly. Its evolution speed was something of a miracle in the Geno universe. Han Sun and Dragon 1 raced to the entrance of that xenogenic space. On the way, Dragon 1 had been thinking quite a bit. He glanced at Han Sun, who seemed content to travel silently beside him. He couldn't help but cough and say, "Brother Dollar, aren't you interested in how I leveled up to deified so quickly? Is becoming deified something special?" Han Sun looked at Dragon 1 with confusion. Dragon 1 didn't know what to say. The speed with which he had become deified made him one of the best of the dragons. Han Sun had made it sound like something average and expected. That depressed him a little. He had intended to show off and maybe brag a little, but he couldn't do that now. After they reached their destination, Han Sun couldn't keep the surprise off his face. The entrance to the xenogenic space was a black hole. It must have become a black hole after the sun exploded. Once the destructive power was expended, it had collapsed into the entrance to a xenogenic space. The two of them had gone there to explore, so they weren't going to be put off or frightened by the intimidating sight. They both entered the black hole. As soon as they did, Han Sun felt as if he had been teleported through space. What was inside the xenogenic space caught Han Sun off guard. Dragon 1 had said that the place was filled with suns, so he had thought the xenogenic space was in space. After getting there, he realized it was a large landmass. The land stretched into the distance, seemingly without end. There were mountains, boulders, and trees everywhere that Han Sun looked. But it was different from ordinary lands. The mountains, boulders, and woods all looked like charcoal. It was like this whole world had turned into ash. Everything in sight was painted in shades of black and white. The scene wasn't colorful like a normal landscape should have been. All of the surrounding land and mountains were a monochromatic pitch black. Some of them even had burned, charcoal-like crystals. The air was frighteningly hot. It felt like the whole place might catch fire any second. Han's son raised his head to the sky, and there he saw what Dragon One had told him about. Several enormous suns hung in the sky. There had to be at least a dozen of them. What do these suns do? Are they planets? Or are they some sort of creature? Han's son wondered aloud. He stared at the suns in the sky as he spoke. He was so far away that he couldn't feel the presence of the suns. He could only feel the scary heat that was coming from them. I don't know. What I do know for sure, though, is that these suns must not have always been here, Dragon One said. Why do you say that? Han's son looked at Dragon One with confusion. Dragon One pointed at a nearby mountain that was black and crystalline. It was all burned, and he said, "Look over there. There is a building next to that mountain. That means there used to be life there." Han's son looked to where Dragon One was pointing. He saw that in the middle of the burned mountain there was a tower. It seemed to have 7 floors. But just like the mountains, boulders, and trees around it, the tower was as black as charcoal. It could have easily been mistaken for a lump of coal. The two of them flew toward the tower, and when they reached it, they found many other charcoal buildings as well. They stumbled across an old charcoal city. Although they saw no creatures, judging from the size of the city, there must have been at least 100,000 creatures living there at one point. But for some reason, the old city was just like the landscape around it. It had become charcoal in the course of a single second. Everything stood perfectly still, retaining the shape it might have once had before it was blackened. Even the leaves still had their veins. This place, I think I have seen it someplace before. Wait, this place is like the place in the sanctuary where I found the little red bird. Is this the Phoenix Nirvana? Han's son was shocked as he came to this conclusion. Chapter 2768. Between two mountains. This place looked like the area in which Han's son had first found the little red bird. Even the mountains and stones were charcoal. The little red bird was born in a place just like this, if you removed the additional suns from the equation. This is an impressive use of the fire element. It turned this whole place into charcoal. That isn't something ordinary heat can do, Dragon One said in awe. Han's son raised his head and looked into the sun high above. He thought the suns were the most suspicious aspect of this realm. Perhaps they weren't even suns at all. They might have been some scary, fire element xenogenics for all he knew. According to the Red Rat survivor, one of the suns exploded and turned them all to dust. So, it is certainly possible that they're living beings. Han's son considered the possibility, but he didn't dare to try teleporting closer to the suns to check. He was there to claim easy rewards, not to needlessly risk his life. Even if the suns were some sort of powerful xenogenic, there was no need for Han's son to risk his own safety. Dragon One tilted his nose into the wind and sniffed, then smiled. It looks like many other creatures have already been here before we arrived. You're a dragon, not a dog, Hansen thought. How can you take a whiff of the air and discern how many people were here before us? Dragon One was oblivious to Hansen's skepticism, though. He went on to say, "The destroyed have been here. The foxes have been here, as well." Dragon One named a dozen different races. Han's son was shocked. He didn't know about most of the races Dragon One mentioned, but Bar and Eldernator had been there. So Dragon One was correct about the presence of the destroyed. "Your nose sure is powerful," Han's son complimented. Dragon One smiled. "That is nothing remarkable. It is just a small trick of mine. I can analyze the substances that creatures and people leave behind, and it lets me learn who they were." "That is so powerful," Han's son said, with honest admiration in his voice. His Dongxian aura was similar to this, but this was more straightforward. As the pair were talking, a shadow appeared. It was heading for the old charcoal city. Han's son and Dragon One looked warily at the shadow. In a place like this, they needed to be cautious until they were certain of who was approaching them. It could very well have been an enemy. They couldn't let their vigilance slip for one moment. "It's Bao Lian of the Extreme King," Hansen thought. He looked at the shadow with shock. He hadn't expected to meet Bao Lian there. But when he had seen Bao Lian before, he was Han Senator Bao Lian had never met Dollar before. So Han Sun stayed silent and didn't say anything. This is a deified from the Extreme King. His name is Bao Lian, Dragon One said with a frown. While they were talking, Bao Lian landed at a place that wasn't too far from them. He observed the two of them, and then he looked at Dragon One and said, "Ah, it is Mr. Dragon One. I didn't expect to see you here. Since we've encountered each other under such unlikely circumstances, I can only consider it as fate. Are you willing to explore this xenogenic space with me?" Bao Lian was surprisingly polite. He didn't act like the average Extreme King elite. Han Sun was surprised. The dragons were brave people, but compared to the Extreme King, they weren't as talented. And the dragons sort of relied on the power and infrastructure of the Extreme King. In a way, the Extreme King were their employers or landlords. There was no need for Bao Lian to behave so politely. Han Sun had no idea that while King Bai was in charge, the Bao family had been doing poorly. They were doing anything that they could to gain an edge. This time, they had sent Bao Lian to explore the new xenogenic space. Bao Lian must have known it was a dangerous endeavor. Cooperating with powerful elites like Dragon One would be safer than exploring alone. "I would like to." Dragon One looked at Han Sun and smiled with his answer. Dragon One was worried that this place might be too dangerous, just as Bao Lian thought it might be. Since they shared a like mind, an alliance seemed to make sense. "Who is this?" Bao Lian asked. Indicating Han Senator Dragon One introduced Han Sun as Dollar. Bao Lian stared at Han Sun in amazement, and he said, "Is this the Dollar who came first place in the Geno Being Scroll battles? I heard your name a long time ago. It is a shame it has taken me so long to finally meet you. You really are a talented young man." Although the Extreme King hadn't had any of their people participate in the Geno Being Scroll fights, Bao Lian had made sure to watch the battles unfold. He recognized Dollar, but he wasn't really as starstruck as he was pretending to be. He only knew there was a guy called Dollar, who was supposedly pretty good. "Mr. Bao Lian, you are more knowledgeable than I am. Can you tell me which civilization might have once occupied a city such as this?" Dragon One asked Bao Lian after their greetings were over. Bao Lian glanced at the buildings all around them. These structures are fairly primitive. Races usually create buildings like this when they are in their infancy. Because this culture was obviously new and underdeveloped, it is difficult to determine which race might have actually owned these. After pausing briefly, Bao Lian pointed at a tower in the old city. On this tower's wall, you can see the traces of a carving. It looks like a carving of a phoenix. And this place seems to have been barbecued by something possessing a frightening amount of power with the fire element. A deified phoenix, perhaps? Dragon One asked in wonder. He quickly looked where Bao Lian was pointing, and he noticed there was indeed a carving there, albeit a slightly blurred one. Very faintly, he could make out the shape of a bird. But Dragon One had never seen one of the legendary, true god phoenixes before. He didn't know if that was what a phoenix actually looked like. Bao Lian nodded and said, "Phoenixes are the alphas of the fire element. It is very rare that a true god phoenix arises, and if one does, even the Extreme King will not dare offend it. If this place really is connected with a phoenix, we are going to have to be careful. We cannot risk provoking it." Dragon One nodded his agreement, then turned the conversation to how they should proceed. Once they decided on a route to follow, they moved past the city and ventured deeper into the xenogenic space. Han Sun pretended to not know who Bao Lian was, and Bao Lian seemed interested enough to meet Han Senator. They talked quite a bit, and Bao Lian seemed to like him. Bao Lian continued to behave humbly, and he didn't act like the typically arrogant Extreme King. But Han Sun knew Bao Lian was a very powerful adversary. The last time they fought, Han Sun found himself in a very tricky situation. And Han Sun had yet to figure out what sort of power Bao Lian had wielded when they last fought. In truth, he was a little afraid of Bao Lian. He needed to figure out how the man's power worked. The two of them got along very well. They chatted so much along the way, it was almost as if they were brothers. "There are creatures over there." Dragon One interrupted them from up front. Han Sun and Bao Lian looked ahead and found themselves looking at two large mountains. They were 10,000 meters high, and a long stretch of wood bridged the distance between them, running from one peak to the other. In the middle of the bridge stood a big black steel bell. Many creatures were standing along the bridge, staring at the black steel bell. Chapter 2769 Two Ape Mountain. The bell's base was 100 meters wide. It hung between the two mountains, and the mass and gravity of the bell made it an impressive sight to anyone within range. Mystical engravings covered the surface of the giant bell, visible even from a great distance because of the size of the bell. The engravings looked rather strange. They seemed to depict a bird that was flying through a complex series of loops and twirls. Han Sun and the others were unsure what it meant. But on the front of the bell, there was an engraving of a true god bird. There was no doubt about this picture. It represented a true god phoenix. Many creatures stood across the bridge, looking up at the black steel bell. But for some reason, none of them were fighting over it. They simply stared up at the object enthralled. Han Sun noticed Bar and Elder Nader among the creatures standing on the bridge. They were staring up at the bell, with the same expression on their faces as the creatures around them. They weren't trying to claim the item as their own, and neither were they leaving. They were transfixed. It was a strange thing for Han Sun to see. Dragon One called to Bar, but Bar paid him no heed. The destroyed's eyes remained firmly locked on the bell. "Something is wrong," Dragon One said quietly. He looked in the direction of the black steel bell and frowned. There was no need for him to say it, though. Han Sun and Bao Lian had already noticed that something was off. Bar and the others seemed to have been trapped by some unseen force. Why else would they be ignoring people who were calling their names? Han Sun secretly cast his Dongxian Sutra. He focused his attention on the two mountains, the wood that bridged them, and the black steel bell, hoping to discern a clue or two from them. As he stared at them, he did notice something. The bridge between the two mountains and the big steel bell had some sort of natural connection. They were subtly releasing some sort of power. It was rather weird. The big mountains, the bridge, the big steel bell. They were composed of three different materials. In ordinary circumstances, they shouldn't have been exuding the same type of power, and yet they were. The energy that radiated from them was all of the same wavelength. Weird. This is so weird. Bao Lian mumbled as he kept looking. "What have you found, Mr. Bao?" Dragon One asked. Bao Lian pointed at the two big mountains and said, "Don't you think these two mountains look rather unique?" "Unique? What kind of unique are you talking about?" Dragon One looked over the two mountains again, and didn't seem to be anything too special about them. "It's their shape. Don't you think those two mountains look like two giant apes?" Bao Lian asked in a strained voice, pointing at the two big mountains. Han Sun had been looking at the two mountains for some time, but he hadn't noticed that. Now that Bao Lian had pointed it out, Han Sun noticed that the two big mountains really did look like two apes holding up a bridge of wood. They supported the weight of the black steel bell, which looked as if it was going to fall any second. Han Sun had many questions about what they were seeing. He was curious about the design, but he didn't come to any conclusions. Dragon One looked at it for a while, and before long, his eyes widened. Two apes holding up a bridge of wood. Does that mean we're actually looking at the legendary Two Ape Mountain? No way. Two Ape Mountain belonged to Sacred, and it was destroyed long ago. Why is it here? This might not be the genuine Two Ape Mountain. For all we know, it just looks similar, Bao Lian said. But he couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from the Two Ape Mountain. It was hard to tell what he was thinking. What is the Two Ape Mountain? Han Sun had never heard the term before. He looked at Bao Lian and Dragon One. In the legends regarding Sacred, tales tell of a very famous mountain, Dragon One explained. Originally, Two Ape Mountain was just a pair of ordinary mountains. They were nothing special. But later on, Sacred Leader and his trusted partner played chess for 7 days and 7 nights. Eventually, the game ended in a tie. So, the Sacred Leader decided to build a bridge between those two mountains and construct a pavilion at the center of the bridge to play chess. That way, he could continue playing chess with that forever trusted partner. The two big mountains looked like old apes, and after the bridge and the pavilion were built, It looked like the two old apes were carrying a carriage. Therefore, Two-Ape Mountain is occasionally called Two Apes Holding Up a Carriage Mountain. Bai Lian carried on with the story, saying, in the legends, that pavilion was used for many chess matches between Sacred Leader and his trusted partner. It is a heavenly topic for those who love chess. But in the legends, when Sacred was destroyed, Two-Ape Mountain was also destroyed. The bridge and the pavilion went missing. What we're looking at here might appear similar, but it isn't actually Two-Ape Mountain. Dragon One went on to say, although moving mountains isn't difficult for deified elites, the most important part of Two-Ape Mountain was the chess records located inside the pavilion. Since the pavilion containing those records is missing, who would have gone to the effort of relocating Two-Ape Mountain all the way out here? The pavilion has been replaced with a big steel bell. I highly doubt that this is the Two-Ape Mountain that came from Sacred. Han Sun didn't really know anything about this, so he had nothing to add to the conversation. He merely listened to them explain the history. A person who could play chess with Sacred Leader? I bet Sacred's partner was very famous. What was his name, and what race did he hail from? Han Sun inquired. Dragon One shrugged and said, that's all I know. It is documented in the history books of our race, but I've never actually read them myself. And the books never did state who Sacred's chess partner was. Back then, Sacred Leader ruled almost the entire universe. He had many strong subordinates. He had 4 holy beasts and 10 generals. All of them were amazingly powerful elites. It would be hard to find out which of them played chess with him, Bao Lian said. Han Sun started to ask something, but he suddenly heard a loud ringing noise. Although the air around them was still and devoid of wind, the black steel bell started to chime. Every time it moved, it unleashed a loud bell chime. The sound that the bell produced seemed entirely ordinary. There was nothing special about the acoustics. It didn't seem to possess any special kind of power. But the next second, Han Sun, Bao Lian, and Dragon One froze. As the bell rang, the charcoal appearance of the trees and the mountains suddenly faded away. Color began to seep back into the black and white world. The charred appearance of the trees vanished, and healthy shades of green and brown swept over them. New leaves sprang into existence as Han Sun and the others watched. The vegetation around them was coming back to life with startling speed. Across the two ape-like mountains, small shrubs and grass rose around and between the rocks. What Han Sun saw was very weird. It was like a dead man coming back to life. A second later, the world around them was full of greenery. Life was spreading to cover every surface, flourishing in unchecked glory. The two mountains started to look green as well. Everything in sight seemed to be radiating a life force. The landscape looked completely different than it had looked before. The only thing that hadn't changed was the black steel bell. It looked exactly as it had before it began to chime. The noise of the bell died down, and it remained where it was, very still. Chapter 2770 God Bird. The bridge itself began to sprout branches, and Bar and the others snapped out of their daze. They all sought to fly away from the growing limbs, but as soon as they started to move, branches came at them from all directions. Bar was a primitive deified elite. With his full power, he could devastate a planet with a single punch. But he couldn't resist those branches that reached out and began to wrap themselves around him. The branches tied him up like a cocoon, with only his head poking out above the leaves. Bar wasn't the only one to be caught. Even the transmutation class Elder Nader was unable to escape. He released his power in a massive surge, but under the force of the branches, his power was like snow melting under a spring sun. His attempts to protect himself dissolved into nothing, and then the branches bound him firmly. No creature upon the plank bridge was exempted from this. They were all tied up in cocoons of various sizes, and soon they were all dangling helplessly from the bridge. As Han Sun looked at them, he was struck by how much they looked like caterpillars. He had often found those insects hanging from the trees near his old house. They would hang from the branches, motionless unless a wind caught them, and waved them back and forth. The sight before him was eerily similar. Han Sun kept observing the captured creatures, falling back as he did. Even Elder Nader had been unable to resist the ensnaring branches. Hansen didn't think he was much stronger than Elder Nader. If he got close, he might end up suffering the same fate. He didn't want to end up snared by the branches too. Dragon 1 and Bao Lian seemed to share his opinion. They all made sure to retreat with haste. The squawking of a bird sounded clearly throughout the sky. Within a second, Han Sun felt a very frightening presence descending on the strange realm. It rushed down from the sky in a blur, moving too quickly for them to react. It was like watching a plane crash. Although the bird itself remained in the sky, the weight of the bird's aura hit the ground, instantly crushing anything on the surface. Han Sun found that his body had been slammed down into the dirt, and he couldn't get up. The scary pressure was slowly pushing him into the ground, like it was made of quicksand. His face had almost been crushed. He couldn't get out. Han Sen's face was on its side, trying to discern where the sound of that bird came from. Far away, up in the sky, he saw a large bird burning with a white flame. It was soaring through the air, and the very scary pressure came from its body. Han Sen couldn't be certain what kind of bird it was. It looked elegant, proud, gorgeous, majestic. It was like a god from the sky. It was like the legends that described the god Phoenix. But Han Sun had never seen a real phoenix before, so he couldn't be sure if he was seeing one now. The big bird was soaring casually over the mountain. Wherever it went, the landscape beneath it came back to life. Every tree, bush, and blade of grass was brimming with life force once more. The big bird flew in slow circles, and it seemed like the whole world was following it, hoping to be given a life force again. The green trees were repopulate with leaves. Flowers were popping up out of the ground. Wherever the bird went, new life followed behind. The deserted wasteland was turning into a tropical paradise. A phoenix. It really is a phoenix. Bao Lian was lying on the ground next to Han Senator. He stared up blankly, seemingly at a loss for how to react. I've been so unlucky recently. I entered an undeveloped xenogenic space and found a true god-class xenogenic phoenix. The chances of that are lower than winning the lottery. Han Sun grumbled in his heart. Fortunately, the phoenix wasn't flying toward them. It flew to the plank bridging the 2-8 mountain. It glided slowly forward on its huge wings until it reached the bridge. After circling the bridge 3 times, the phoenix with its white flames descended onto the wood. The fire on its body didn't harm the wood. It actually seemed to be forcing more life force into the plank, and it made the branches grow even faster. The phoenix then lowered its head to look at the creature nearest to it. The creature looked like a golem, from what Han Sun could see through the cocoon of branches. Only the golem's head was clearly visible. Answer a question for me. If the answer satisfies me, then I will forgive you for offending me. The phoenix didn't physically speak, but everyone who could see the phoenix could hear its voice in their minds. I will answer any question you would like me to. What do you want to know? The golem-like creature said. One day, you and your partner encounter danger. One of you has to die for the other to be saved, and you have the power to decide. Do you choose to die for your partner to be saved? Or would you prefer that your partner perish, so that you could live? The voice of the phoenix rumbled, shaking their minds as it spoke. Everyone was shocked. They had expected the deity to ask about some ancient secret. They never expected a question like this. And it didn't seem like the question had a single correct answer. Different people would respond in different ways. But since the phoenix had already asked, the golem couldn't refuse to answer. It swallowed and replied, I would sacrifice myself to save my partner so that she could live. Hypocrite. The phoenix's voice played in everyone's head. It sounded disdainful. The next second, Han Sun and the others watched the phoenix lower its head. It opened its beak in the golem's direction, but the phoenix didn't bite down. Rather, it made a sucking motion, as if it was drawing in a breath. A weird power came out of the golem's body and vanished into the phoenix's mouth. After that strange power was taken away, the golem's head looked like a dried-up husk. Then, the entire creature turned into sand and scattered across the wind. No trace of the being was left to see. Everyone stared at the place where the golem had been in silence. Although the golem was just a king-class creature, its power had been drained until it was nothing more than dust. It was a bit too scary to fully comprehend. The phoenix didn't seem to think that what it had done was a big deal. Ignoring the sand that was still leaking from the now empty cocoon, the phoenix moved to the next cocoon creature, like it was walking down the aisle in a grocery store. This creature's head looked like it belonged to an octopus or squid. Han-sun recognized this one. This being had been following Elder Nader, so it had to be one of Elder Nader's students. That creature turned pale when the phoenix looked at him. And then he heard the phoenix's voice sound again. Once more, it was in everyone's head. One day, you and your partner encounter danger. One of you has to die for the other to be saved, and you have the power to decide. Do you choose to die for your partner to be saved? Or would you prefer that your partner perish, so that you could live? That creature was terrified, but it noticed that the question was exactly the same as before. He was so happy. The golem had already given one answer, and that answer was wrong. So, the squid creature assumed that the other answer must be correct. Thinking of that, the creature hastily shouted, "I would choose to save myself." Obscene. Before the creature could explain why he had chosen to save himself at his partner's expense, the phoenix's angry voice rumbled in everyone's heads. The phoenix lowered its head and drew in a breath. The creature's power was ripped out of it, and the body turned into dust. The wind carried it away. A chill sank into the hearts of all the onlookers, and goosebumps flared all over their skin. They thought that giving a different answer to the question would allow them to live. But now, it seemed as if the question posed by the phoenix had no correct answer. It all depended on the phoenix's mood. Chapter 2771, You Can Eat This Han-sun. Bao Lian and Dragon 1 felt a cold sweat gather across their brows. There was nothing in the world that was scarier than an unreasonable deity. It was obvious that the god Phoenix wasn't acting rationally. You, answer this question. The Phoenix turned to another king-class noble. That person was also a student of Elder Nader, and he was asked the same question. Master. The guy seemed to be on the verge of tears. He spoke to Elder Nader with a trembling voice. Elder Nader's face turned green. He had brought many of his students there to explore the new xenogenic space. He hadn't expected them to run face first into a true god. Such a being was a truly terrifying existence. He knew this was going to be bad. But this student was behaving with such weakness. He was a king-class elite with destroyed blood. And yet he sounded weaker than some low-ranking outsider. Answer my question. The flames across the phoenix's body exploded, covering the skies and the earth with a white flame. The eyes of the bird stared down at the destroyed king with demonic intensity. The destroyed student looked pale, and he hurried up to answer. I would listen to my partner. If she wanted me to live, I would live. If she wanted me to die, I would die. What a wimp. The phoenix grunted callously. It opened its mouth and drew in a breath. Just like the other two creatures, the destroyed king's body was reduced to nothing but ash. Every person's heart sank. It was obvious that the phoenix was playing with them. No matter what they answered, they were going to die. If you want to kill me, kill me. I'm not answering your crappy bird-brained question, shouted a nameless king when he saw the phoenix looking down on him. If that is what you desire, then I will do it. The phoenix was still acting very high-class and elegant. It lowered its head, opened its beak and inhaled. The king dissolved into dust. Han-sun's heart sank. He had been hoping that the phoenix's question was similar to the wishes offered by the gods. He had suspected that if he didn't answer the question, the phoenix might not be able to hurt him. But after watching the death of the most recent victim, it was evident things weren't like that. Dragon 1 and Bao Lian's faces looked gray, and sweat had beaded across their faces. They thought their feelings would be reflected in Han-sun, and that they would feel hopeless. The phoenix asked the same question to another few creatures, but no matter what they answered, the results were the same. They all had their life forces ripped out of them. The powerful Elder Nader was a transmutation deified, but he could only watch the events unfold. He couldn't resist or do anything about it. Eventually, the phoenix came before Elder Nader. Elder Nader's 3 heads and 6 eyes stared back at the phoenix. It looked as if he wanted to attack the phoenix, but his body was bound too tightly by the branches. He couldn't even move, let alone fight. He couldn't even wiggle his fingers. The branches hadn't just trapped his body. If the situation was that simple, Then his elite transmutation powers would have allowed him to turn a simple exhale into an end-of-the-world thunder god. He wouldn't be rendered helpless by mere physical restraints. But now, Elder Nader couldn't exert any strength. He wasn't even sure if his power had been contained or drained entirely. As everyone waited for Elder Nader to die, the phoenix turned its face away. It turned around, and its raptor-like gaze locked onto Han Sun and the two others on the ground next to him. The hearts of the three began to bound. Before they realized what was going on, the phoenix flapped its wings and flew down the mountain. Oh no! Han Sun suddenly felt sick with fear. Why had that phoenix suddenly changed its mind, leaving a deified elite to fly toward them instead? The faces of Dragon One and Bao Lian turned green. Losing all sense of decorum, Dragon One shouted at Bao Lian. "Mr. Bao, if we don't fight, we don't stand a chance." Bao Lian's face darkened with frustration. "You think I don't want to fight? Have you been paying attention? The power gap is too significant. Even though my king body isn't suppressed, I can't seem to use its power. There is no chance of fighting back. Aren't you a dragon? Don't you call yourself the bravest race? Don't you guys have high resistance to any kind of power? Can you break the suppression on me so that I can activate my king body? Perhaps that way we can get out of this mess." Dragon One sank against his bonds. "If I could break free, do you think I would remain here trapped?" The discussion was pointless. The two of them were locked down there, and neither of them could get free. Dragon One could see that Bao Lian was useless, so he shouted at Han Sun, "Dollar, if you can escape, take us away now. Do it before it is too late." Han Sun shook his head. Even if he used his super god spirit body to escape, it would only last a second. Once that time was up, the phoenix's power would be back to suppressing him. He was a dead man either way. There was nothing that the three of them could do to escape. And by now, the phoenix had reached them. It landed 10 meters away from the three and looked at Han Sr. "No way. There are so many creatures you can eat, but you choose to eat me? I am not Tang Sanzang. What are you staring at me for?" Han Sun felt so depressed. He prepared to activate his super god spirit body. Although his chances of escape were low, it was worth a shot. Han Sun was going to wait until the phoenix asked its question, and as soon as it started speaking, he would use his super god spirit body to teleport away. Perhaps he would survive somehow. But when the phoenix opened its beak, it didn't ask a question. The scary suction pulled on Han Sun's body. Oh no, it's all over. Han Sun thought in sudden despair. It was too late for him to use his super god spirit body now. Han Sun thought he was going to be turned into dust, but that wasn't what happened. His body flew through the air toward the phoenix. Before Han Sun realized what was going on, the phoenix flapped its wings and shot up into the air beneath Han Sun, catching him on its back. Han Sun was sitting on the white fire, but it didn't feel hot. It was a very warm, relaxing sensation. He felt as if he was sitting in a hot spring. The phoenix's body had a seemingly limitless life force. The feeling rushed through him, and it made his body feel like old wood receiving life again. His cells were active, and they began to multiply at a much faster rate. What is going on? Han Sun was confused. Bao Lian, Dragon One, and many of the other creatures that were wrapped up in branches were looking quite confused. They couldn't believe this was happening. They all thought Dollar was going to bite the dust. They would never have guessed that he would end up riding the phoenix. They all stared at Han Sun in shock, unsure what sort of reaction they should give. After the phoenix placed Han Sun on its back, it flapped its wings and returned to the wooden bridge. Han Sun sat atop the phoenix's back. He could tell that the phoenix didn't hold any hostility toward him. The phoenix dropped back onto the bridge, landing in front of Elder Nader, who was tied up like a cocoon. The bird's resonating voice played in everyone's head again. "You can eat this," the phoenix said. All around Han Sun, the jaws of the onlookers fell open. Even though the phoenix hadn't used Elder Nader's name, it was obvious that the bird thought the destroyed would be tasty and nutritious, and he wanted Han Sun to eat the man. Chapter 2772. As long as you like, you're letting me eat him? Han Sun looked surprised. Yes. He is the best meal here. Are you worried that he won't taste good? That is fine if so. You can have your pick. Eat anything you want. If you like it, it is yours, the phoenix said. Looks of confused horror covered the faces of Elder Nader and all the others. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. They had all been trapped in this place, and the phoenix considered them to be nothing more than food. Dollar, however, had been invited to eat with the phoenix like a guest of honor. If he wanted to, he could consume them until his belly was full. Although Han Sun had no idea why the phoenix was treating him differently, he felt as if he was relatively safe now. You're giving them all to me? Han Sun asked, looking at Elder Nader and the others. Of course. Assuming you like them, that is. The phoenix smiled. It was like a doting mother who had found an opportunity to spoil her kid. It was difficult for Han Sun to comprehend its current behavior, given that he had just watched it toy with the lives of its prisoners. It had turned kings and deifieds into piles of dust with ease. I can do whatever I want to them? I mean, if I don't want to eat them, can I let them go? Han Sun asked. Yes, as long as that is what you want. The phoenix looked as if it really was spoiling him. Han Sun only wanted to save Dragon One, but then he hesitated. He decided to save Bao Lian too. He wanted to beat Bao Lian by himself. He didn't want the man to die like this before Han Sun could settle the score between them. Then let those two go. Han Sun pointed at Dragon One and Bao Lian. When the phoenix heard Han Sun's request, it didn't move. But Bao Lian and Dragon One, who were being pressed into the ground, suddenly felt the crushing gravitational force lift from their bodies. Brother Dollar, I really appreciate this, Dragon One declared, his face looking rather shaken. Immediately after he finished speaking, he flew away. He didn't dare stay any longer. What you've done here today will be paid back in full. I owe you one, Bao Lian said. And then he left with Dragon One. Mr. Dollar, help. Many elites that were bound to the bridge had seen that the phoenix agreed to free Dragon One and Bao Lian at Dollar's request. They were shocked, but hope quickly dawned in their eyes. A few desperate kings called out to Han Sun for help. I can really do whatever I want with these people? Han Sun asked again, looking at the god phoenix with uncertainty. Of course. They are all yours, the phoenix said with a smile. Han Sun squinted and looked at Elder Nader and all the others. He remained silent for a long moment, and his reluctance made everyone worry profusely. Mr. Dollar, please be kind and let us live. I have a family back home to raise, begged a king from a small race. I have no association with your people, and neither am I cooperating with you. Why should I save you? Han Sun looked at the king and spoke coldly. The king immediately answered, I have many xenogenic treasures and genes. I can give them all to you. I just want to live. I will owe you so much. Are you truly willing to do that? I haven't forced you, Han Sun said with a blink. Of course I'm willing to. I will be eternally thankful if I'm allowed to live. You will be my savior for all time, and I will work my hardest to pay you back, the king quickly said. Mr. Dollar, I am willing to offer you all my treasures and xenogenic genes. Mr. Dollar, please take mine. Suddenly, many kings were fighting to be the ones to give Han Sun treasure. They pleaded with Han Sun to show mercy and let them live. If you guys are being this nice, I won't decline your offers, Han Sun said, his voice slightly awkward. He quickly collected the treasures and xenogenic genes from the kings. And then he asked the phoenix to remove the restrictions binding them. The kings were delighted. After they thanked Han Sun, they were quick to escape that place. Brother Dollar, this is all I have. Is it enough to spare my life? Bar said. Bar never saved up much. The only thing of real value that he possessed was a deified saw blade. And it was only at the primitive level. If Brother Bar is willing to give that up, then I will accept it. Han Sun nodded and took Bar's saw blade. The phoenix then released the restrictions holding Bar. When the deified elites who were present saw Bar give up a deified treasure in exchange for his life, they all decided to follow his example. They were willing to give up their deified treasures in exchange for permission to live. Han Sun turned to the other deifieds with a wolfish grin. He said, Bar and his buddy Dia Robber are old clients of mine. That is why he is getting special treatment. If the rest of you would like to purchase your lives, deified treasure alone is not enough. Amazement swept through the deified prisoners. That was especially true of Elder Nader. His face kept warping, shifting from green to white as his emotions vacillated between nausea and rage. Before, he had thought of Dollar as a useless nobody. He refused to team up with Dollar. Who would have known his life would end up in this man's hands? He wasn't optimistic enough to believe that his chances of being saved were 50-50. He probably wouldn't be allowed to live, even if he gave Han Sun everything that he had. As he watched Han Sun scam the other deified elites, Elder Nader's first impression of Han Sun grew deeper. This was a greedy man. Those were the 5 words he would pick to describe Han Sr. This guy is so greedy. No wonder people call him Dollar. Now that the other deifieds were being forced to give up all their prized possessions in exchange for their freedom, they also realized what sort of person Han Sun really was. But losing all their money was better than dying there. It might have been unpleasant, but the deifieds paid up rather quickly. None of them were bold enough to try to bargain with Han Senator a short time later. Han Sun was a much wealthier man, and all the elites that were bound by the bridge were released. Only Elder Nader remained, and he hadn't said a word thus far. Elder Nader couldn't even move his head to look away. His face was turning a deeper and deeper shade of red, but he didn't say anything. I don't believe you will release everyone from all these races, yet dare to kill me. Killing me in front of all these witnesses is like declaring war upon the destroyed, Elder Nader thought to himself. But still he did not speak. Mr. Phoenix, thank you for your kindness and generosity. The rest of these people are useless to me. You can have them all. Han Sun bowed to the Phoenix. Elder Nader's mouth fell open, but before he could protest or say anything, the god Phoenix opened its mouth and drew in a breath. Elder Nader turned into clouds of dust. Everyone stared in mute silence. They were terrified by the fact that a transmutation deified had been murdered in an instant, but they were also happy that they had made a smarter decision. If they hadn't coughed up Han Sen's ransom demand, they would have ended up like Elder Nader. Elder Nader stayed at home for too long. He must have forgotten how dangerous the universe is. Even to the moment of his death, he was just thinking about preserving his reputation. Bar shook his head casually, then chuckled a little. Although the destroyed were powerful, they didn't have many deifieds. Losing a transmutation deified like that was a big blow to them. But Elder Nader had been famous for too long. Instead of spending his time fighting for survival in the universe, he had spent the last few hundred years teaching students. He had lost his edge and forgotten how cruel the universe can be. He had taken his reputation too seriously. When everyone was gone, Han Sun bowed to the god Phoenix and said, "Thank you for your help. If there is something you need me to do, I will try my best to help you. If there is nothing else, then I will take my leave." After Han Sun said that, the Phoenix picked him up in its beak. It flew deep into the xenogenic space. You're tuning in to the Limei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.